Hello friends, I am Mr. Ghost, and I am here to help you today. I know, you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, and relax. I've spent the last 12 years mixing and editing in small studios all over the city. I thought I'd seen everything. Bad singers, broken gear, strange background noises caused by faulty wiring. But 3 months ago I started working in a place I'd never set foot in before. It's an old studio on the outskirts of town. From the outside it looks abandoned. The windows are dusty, and the paint on the front door is peeling. I took the job because it paid well, and I figured I could handle a creaky floorboard or two. But after the first week, I knew something was wrong. I want to tell you exactly what happened step by step so you understand why I packed up and left last night with my heart pounding. On my first day, I walked into the control room and saw rows of analog equipment. I saw a vintage mixing console that hadn't been updated since the 70s. The owner, a quiet guy who barely spoke, showed me around. He told me the console still worked fine and insisted everything was in good shape. I didn't argue. I got my laptop set up, tested some cables, and ran a quick recording test. The playback sounded clean, or so I thought at the time. I heard a faint hiss in the background, but I didn't dwell on it. Old studios usually have some level of noise. During my second session, I recorded a local jazz trio. When I played back the tracks, I noticed a low rumble that I couldn't attribute to any instrument. I combed through each track, muting the drums, then the bass, then the piano, trying to isolate the sound. My stomach tightened when I realized it was on a separate track that shouldn't have existed. I'd only set up 3 input channels, but I found a 4th waveform that looked faint but steady. When I played it by itself, it sounded like a distant voice humming a melody. It didn't match the jazz piece the trio had been playing. It was slower and seemed to lack a clear patter. I tried to clean it up with noise reduction, but each time I applied another pass, the humming got sharper. I started sweating because I didn't understand how that could happen. Usually, noise reduction strips away frequencies, but this was revealing more detail. I decided to ignore it for the moment and finish the jazz trio's mix. They didn't notice anything weird. They took their final tracks, paid, and left. I stayed behind to do more tests. I recorded silence for 5 minutes, no microphone plugged in, no instruments, no people in the room. When I played it back, I heard distant murmuring. I jumped up from my chair and checked the studio door. It was locked, and no one else was around. My heart thumped against my chest. I told myself it was probably electromagnetic interference or something technical, but I couldn't ignore how it sounded like an actual group of people speaking in low tones. I spent the next week trying to figure out the source. I checked all the wiring, replaced cables, and moved preamps around. Nothing made the voices stop. Each time I recorded silence, I heard something new. Once it sounded like a man and a woman humming a short tune in unison. Another time it sounded like at least 4 or 5 voices whispering at the same time. I grew more tense with each session. My hands started shaking whenever I hit the record button. By the end of the second week, the voices were more distinct. They were trying to form a single melody, almost like a group practice, except they never got it right. I heard them starting and stopping. Sometimes they were off key. Sometimes they paused in the middle. It was disturbing to hear them so clearly, because I knew there was no logical explanation for it. The old consoles didn't have any hidden tracks, and I wasn't pulling from an archive. Each recording was brand new, but the voices were always there. I told the studio owner. He shrugged and said he had heard rumors about the place being haunted, but he didn't seem worried. He said as long as the paying clients didn't complain, we should keep things going. I felt a chill when he said that. I realized he knew something he didn't want to share, but I needed the money, so I tried to ignore it. I kept the session short, and I tried to finish my editing at home on my laptop. That's when the problem followed me home. I took some of the raw tracks to my apartment so I could analyze them with better software. I thought maybe I could find a frequency spike or something that would explain the voices. One night I left the recordings running while I stepped into the kitchen to make a quick sandwich. My apartment was quiet, and I was by myself. As the audio played through my headphones on the desk, I heard a sudden clear line of melody. It sounded like a short vocal phrase repeated over and over. I froze in the hallway, my mouth dry. I walked back to the computer. The waveform was changing in real time. It was as if someone was actively re-recording the track. My heart pounded. I listened closer and realized it was the same tune I'd heard in the studio, but more complete this time. Each repetition added a note or two. I shut down the computer. I didn't want to deal with it anymore that night. I tried to sleep, but my head throbbed with thoughts of those voices. I woke up covered in sweat around 3 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the apartment. My door was still locked, and no one was inside. I turned on all the lights and sat on the couch until sunrise. The next morning, I tried a different approach. I recorded myself speaking into my phone just to test if the interference could appear outside the studio files. I started by saying my name and the date. Then I stopped. When I played it back, I heard my own voice and then behind it a faint hum that slowly grew louder. After about 10 seconds, the hum turned into a rough outline of that same melodic phrase. I stared at my phone, my skin crawling. I felt dizzy and pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. I didn't know what else to do, so I deleted the file and put my phone on the kitchen counter. Over the following days, my anxiety got worse. I couldn't concentrate on editing. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. My chest felt tight. I tried to do more research, but every search result talked about normal audio interference or urban legends. I found no logical explanation for the voices hijacking every recording I made. I started leaving the studio earlier, telling the owner I was sick. At home, I avoided recording anything, but the voices still showed up in my existing files. Sometimes, out of nowhere, my speakers emitted short bursts of static followed by faint melodic lines. It made my stomach churn because I never knew when it would happen. One evening, I decided to confront it head-on. I set up my laptop in the living room, plugged in a USB microphone and recorded myself for an hour. I tried to speak calmly, describing my apartment, describing the time of day, anything that popped into my head. My throat felt dry the entire time. I stopped the recording after an hour and listened. The first 15 minutes sounded normal. I heard my voice, the hum of my fridge, and the rumble of a passing truck outside. Then, around the 20-minute mark, a voice that wasn't mine faded in. It started humming the same melody, but this time it sounded almost complete. I felt a rush of cold sweat on my back. My heartbeat sped up and my hands got clammy on the keyboard. The voice repeated the melody 4 times, each time a little louder until it sounded right up against the microphone. Then it faded back out. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen. My breathing grew rapid, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I slammed the laptop shut and paced around my apartment, gripping my hair. The next day I went back to the studio. I told myself I would try to solve the problem once and for all. I arrived around noon. The owner wasn't there. I locked the door behind me and headed straight to the control room. I turned on the lights, booted up the console, and sat in front of the mixing board. I pressed record with no mics connected, same as before. This time I watched the waveform in real time. For the first few minutes it was flat. Then it started to show tiny spikes. I heard them in my headphones, the same voices. They were humming in unison, stopping and starting. I took a deep breath. My heart pounded, and my palms felt wet on the console. I decided to speak into the empty room, asking, "Who's there?" I wanted to see if that would get any response. I felt ridiculous, but I needed to try. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then, in the headphones, I heard a sharp burst of static. After that, there was a single voice humming the melody, very softly. It repeated the first 3 notes, paused, then repeated them again. It felt like it was trying to learn the tune step by step. My pulse raced. I recorded for about 10 minutes more, barely moving. Then, I stopped it. I saved a file as a single take and played it back. The voice was there, same as I'd heard in real time. No explanation. I knew I couldn't stay in that place much longer. I gathered my things and left. Over the next week, I tried to finish the projects I had on my plate without using that console. I used my laptop with older recordings that were already done doing basic edits that didn't require new audio. I tried to keep my mind off the voices, but every now and then, my laptop speakers would crackle with that same static, like the voices were trying to break through. My shoulders would tense up, and my mouth would go dry. One night, I got home and felt exhausted. I fell asleep on my couch with my phone in my hand. Around midnight, I woke up to a muffled sound. My phone was playing something even though I hadn't hit any buttons. I turned on the screen and saw a recording app open with a waveform scrolling. I listened. It was that same melody again, but now it sounded fuller, as if multiple voices were harmonizing. My heart pounded so hard that I felt a dull ache in my chest. I sat there trembling, and I realized I couldn't keep ignoring this. I shut off my phone, threw it on the coffee table, and stood up to gather my gear. I decided to drive to the studio and leave a note for the owner saying I was done. I got there around 2 in the morning. The place looked dark and quiet. I parked in front, unlocked the door with my key, and flipped on the hallway lights. The building smelled musty. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood. I made my way to the control room to leave my resignation letter. As I stepped inside, I saw the console lights flicker. That was unusual because I hadn't turned anything on yet. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my hands shake. I set the letter on top of the console, and took one last look at the equipment. Then, out of nowhere, the speakers crackled. My legs felt weak, and I almost lost my balance. I forced myself to stand still. The crackle turned into a slow hum. It was that same tune, but now it sounded complete. Like all the voices finally aligned. It lasted for about 15 seconds, perfectly in tune before fading into silence. My entire body trembled. I grabbed my car keys and left.
I haven't been back since.
I woke up this morning in my apartment, and I didn't hear any voices. I haven't checked my phone or laptop yet, because I'm worried the sounds might still be there. I just know that I'm not going near that studio again. I'm telling you all this in a calm voice, but inside I'm shaking. I've never felt so unsettled in my life. Everything I've described happened exactly as I said. I never found a rational explanation, and I can't prove it to you unless you listen to the files. But I'm not playing them for anyone because I don't want to hear them myself. Inga, I want to move forward and forget about that haunting melody, if that's even possible. That's the story, with every disturbing detail included. I can still feel my pulse racing when I remember those voices, but there's nothing more to say. I'm out. That's how it ended. I left. I'm not going back, and I'm not recording anything again. At least not for a while. I first heard about the old mansion from a local historical society. They wanted photos for their upcoming brochure. The place was known for its ornate architecture and long-abandoned interior. I'm a professional photographer who specializes in old structures, so this sounded like a great job. I didn't expect anything strange. I didn't expect anything disturbing. I just wanted to capture the decaying grandeur of a forgotten building. But something else showed up in my pictures. Something that shouldn't have been there. I remember driving up to the mansion for the first time. The building looked huge against the gray sky. The front yard was overgrown with tall weeds, and I saw an old iron fence with rust all over it. Pieces of paint were flaking off the wooden panels near the windows. There was a chill in the air, but I figured it was just the weather. On my first day on site, I focused on getting the exterior shots. I set up my tripod, adjusted the camera settings, and framed the shot so I could capture the mansion's symmetrical style. The second floor had large windows framed by carved wooden accents. The building's stone foundation was cracked in a few places, and the porch steps looked uneven. I took about a dozen photos from different angles. Nothing unusual happened while I was there. I just heard some birds in the distance and a bit of wind whistling through broken windows. That was all. When I got home, I immediately loaded the images onto my computer. I scrolled through them one by one, checking exposure, clarity, composition, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. In every photo of the mansion's facade, there was a faint silhouette of a man standing in the second floor window. He wore an outfit that looked old-fashioned, maybe Victorian. It was a long coat with a high collar. I didn't remember seeing anyone there. The house was supposed to be abandoned. Still, sometimes squatters or curious onlookers wander into these places. I assumed it was just someone who had gotten inside. The next day, I went back with a bit of caution in mind. I figured that if someone was living there, I should ask them to stay out of my shots. The Historical Society didn't want random people in the photos. When I arrived, I noticed the main door was off its hinges. The interior was dark and smelled like mold. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed down the long hallway. No answer. The floor creaked under my feet. I peered into a few rooms on the first floor. Everything looked empty. Broken furniture lay scattered around. Torn wallpaper hung off the walls. A wet, musty odor lingered. Still, I didn't see a living soul. I went back outside and set up my tripod again. I used the same angles as before, snapped several shots. The place looked the same, so I moved on to a few close-up details of the front porch columns and the rotting steps. Then I packed up my gear and headed home. That evening I reviewed the new shots. My heart started beating faster when I saw the figure again. Now it looked like he was standing closer to the window glass. I could see more detail in his face, sunken cheeks and a kind of blank stare. I felt a pang of unease, like a rock dropping into my gut. I checked all the images side by side. In each sequence he wasn't just there, he was inching closer to the camera. By the last photo it looked like he was pressed right up against the window. I stayed up late trying to reason this out. Maybe it was some old trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. I cleaned my gear thoroughly. I compared the photos in my editing software. I zoomed in, adjusted lighting, tried different filters. The more I zoomed, the more detailed he became. The clothes looked worn and dusty. It was as if he were actually in that room, staring straight out at me. I felt a tightness in my chest. My mouth went dry. I couldn't find a logical explanation. I decided to go back a third time, but this time I wanted to check the second floor directly. I arrived mid-afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, and the shadows made the building look even more ominous. I carried my camera bag with a flashlight. Inside, the wooden floors groaned under my shoes. A narrow staircase led to the second level. The banister was cracked, and part of the stair treads looked weak. I gripped the railing and took each step carefully. The air grew colder as I climbed. At the top of the stairs I found a long hallway. There were several doors, most of them slightly ajar. I poked my head into each room, shining the flashlight around. Dust particles floated in the beam. Most rooms were empty, aside from debris. One had an old mirror hanging crookedly. Its glass was covered in a thick layer of grime. Another had tattered curtains. The second floor windows all faced the front yard, so I tried to match the one that showed up in my photos. Eventually, I found a room with a large window facing the front. The glass was cracked, and the frame was covered in chips of paint. There was no sign of anyone in there, no footprints on the dusty floor, no evidence of recent activity. I stood there for a minute, scanning every corner. I shivered. My palms felt clammy. The light flickered slightly. Maybe the battery was running low. I had this strange sense that someone was watching me, but I couldn't see anyone. I thought I heard something behind me, like a faint rustle. I spun around, flashlight pointed. Nothing, just the creaking of the house. I let out a shaky breath and returned to my car. I decided to shoot more exterior photos before the sun went down. When I got outside, the wind had picked up. It blew leaves and trash across the yard. I set up my tripod in the same spot as before, double-checked my lens, and started clicking away. I felt my heart pounding as I worked. Each time I pressed the shutter, a spike of dread shot through me. Back home, I hesitated before reviewing the new set. My gut told me I'd see him again. Sure enough, he was there. Same window, same figure, but this time his face was clearer. I could even make out lines around his eyes. His posture looked rigid, like he was leaning forward. In one photo, he appeared to be touching the glass from inside. I felt a chill spread across my arms. My throat got tight. I thought about how I had gone into that very room hours earlier. He hadn't been there, or at least I hadn't seen him. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself maybe it was a reflection of some object outside, but I couldn't force myself to believe that. It looked too human, and the way it got closer with every shot made my skin crawl. I tossed and turned at night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that face staring at me through a pane of cracked glass. A week later, I got a call from the Historical Society, asking for an update. They wanted the images soon. I wasn't sure how to explain what I had captured. Usually I deliver polished architectural photos with no mysteries. But I wasn't about to turn in these shots without figuring out what was happening. So, I went back one more time. I told myself it was just to get enough pictures so I could pick one that didn't have that figure. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sky was overcast. The light was flat, and the air smelled like rain. I walked around the property trying different angles. I even sat up behind some dead shrubs to change the perspective. I hoped that whatever this was wouldn't show up if I changed my position. But the entire time, I felt a pressure in my chest, like I was about to see something I couldn't handle. My hands started shaking. I had to steady the camera by gripping the tripod firmly. My breathing got shallow. I wiped sweat off my forehead. I took about 50 shots, each from different spots around the yard. I didn't have the nerve to go inside again. The whole place felt charged like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept looking at the second floor window as I worked. Several times I thought I saw movement from inside, like a quick flicker of motion. I tried brush it off. That night, I sat down with my computer, and my heart was hammering in my chest. The first few images looked normal, but by the 10th one, the figure returned. This time, he was right up against the window. His hands were pressed to the glass, and his eyes stared straight into the camera lens. Every shot after that showed him, but in each image, the expression on his face looked more intense. It was like he wanted to get out, like he was beckoning me. My throat tightened again. My stomach felt like it had a knot in it. The last picture was the worst. His face filled the window completely, and I swear I could see the outline of his breath on the glass, like a faint white fog. My legs went numb. I actually pushed my chair back as if I expected him to come right through the screen. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the images over and over. I kept seeing his eyes. They seemed so fixed on me. I started questioning my own sanity. Could these images be corrupted in some way? Could my camera be malfunctioning? But how would that explain the details of his clothing and face? It didn't add up. The next day, I told the Historical Society that I needed more time. I said something about technical issues. They gave me an extension. I felt a heavy sense of dread every time I thought about that mansion. The idea of returning made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just walk away from the job. I needed those final shots. I also needed to know I wasn't losing my mind. Against my better judgment, I drove back that evening. The sun was starting to set. The clouds were dark. I parked on the street, leaving the headlights on. I just wanted a couple of quick pictures, maybe from the side of the house this time. I stepped out of the car, camera in hand. The wind whipped around me, and the branches of the nearby trees groaned. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I forced myself forward. I kept picturing that second-floor window. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my ears. I found a spot near the side fence where I could see part of the mansion's front. I set up the camera and snapped a few pictures. I glanced at the window. I didn't see any movement. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the previews on the camera screen. At first, nothing showed up. I felt a small rush of relief. Then I switched to a different angle, closer to the front. I zoomed in on the preview, and he was there, not in the window, but outside, near the porch steps. I actually gasped and dropped the camera. It tumbled into the grass. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed it and looked again. The next image showed an empty porch. No figure. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. That was enough for me. I gathered my tripod quickly, stuffed it into my trunk, and jumped into my driver's seat. I locked the doors and stared at the mansion. My breath came fast and shallow. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel the blood rushing to my head. I felt certain someone was watching me from one of those windows, maybe from the shadows around the corner of the house. I started the engine and pulled away, refusing to look in the rearview mirror until I was well down the road. When I finally got home, I backed up the new shots onto my computer. I hesitated before opening the folder. My fingers felt cold on the mouse. I looked at the last photos from the side fence. The figure was definitely there in one shot, right by the porch, wearing the same Victorian clothing, staring straight at the camera. The next shot showed only the empty porch, no sign of him at all. My breathing turned shallow again. My shoulders tensed up. I felt that crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was right behind me. I swiveled around in my chair, but the room was empty. I haven't gone back to that mansion since. The Historical Society keeps asking for the final images, and I gave them a set that doesn't show the figure. I don't know if they'll notice anything off about the shots I provided. I'm still worried that something might appear in the background of one of them. I don't even want to think about the possibility of them finding that figure closer and closer in each successive image. Now, every time I drive by an old building, I feel a rush of anxiety. I think about that face, those eyes, the way he kept moving closer to me, shot by shot. Part of me wants to delete every single file, destroy the memory cards, and pretend none of this happened. But I can't do that. Those images are proof of something I can't explain. It's a reminder that there are places we don't fully understand, and sometimes something there notices us too. am trying to push forward with my work. I'm focusing on less isolated properties these days. I prefer places with more foot traffic where I won't feel so alone. The bad mansion still nags at me. I think about the second floor, the cracked window, and the figure standing behind the glass, drawing closer every time I try to capture a piece of the past. And that feeling of dread doesn't fade, no matter how many other projects I take on. It's there, just under the surface, waiting to remind me of what I saw and what kept staring back at me. I stood at the edge of a sandy pit, sweat trickling down my forehead, while the sun burned my neck. I wasn't sure if I'd found something revolutionary or if I was just wasting my time. At that moment, I couldn't see beyond my own excitement. I never expected to see my reflection move on its own a few days later. I never expected to feel so powerless and anxious, completely alone under the desert sky. But that's exactly what happened. My name is Daniel, and I've been working as an archaeologist for most of my adult life. I've traveled to remote locations and crawled into dusty tombs more times than I can count. But the site in the Atacama Desert felt different from the start. I had a permit to excavate a cluster of old ruins that barely showed on satellite images. The local authorities didn't care much about them. They thought I was just another guy on a wild goose chase. I felt the same, but I pushed forward because that's what I do. I explore, I dig, I research, and I can't stop. On the day I found the entrance to the underground chamber, I remember the dryness in the air. My lips were cracked, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. The area was surrounded by loose rocks and scattered debris from earlier attempts at excavations. It was nothing impressive from the outside, just a small indentation in the ground that suggested there might be a cavity underneath. I chipped away at the dirt and rocks with a pickaxe, then tried to clear the entrance. After several hours, I felt a small rush of cool air against my face. That was the first hint that there was something buried down there. I rigged up a basic pulley system to lower my gear into the hole. I set up a rope ladder and double-checked everything. I always do that before climbing into an unknown space. The climb down took about 10 minutes, and I kept shining my flashlight around to make sure I wasn't descending into a giant empty pit. The chamber I reached was narrow at first. The walls were smooth, almost polished. My flashlight beam bounced off the surface, and I noticed a faint reflection of myself on the wall. I thought it was just the shine of a well-preserved rock or some old decorative stone. I shrugged it off and kept moving deeper. The passageway opened into a broader chamber about 20 feet below the surface. My boots crunched on the ground, and the sound echoed around me. Everything was silent except for my breathing and the small sounds of my movements. I set my pack on the floor and shone my flashlight around the space. The walls were lined with large slabs of stone that looked carefully placed. I saw markings in a language I couldn't identify at first glance. I took some photos, scribbled a few notes in my journal, and continued exploring. There was a strange energy in that chamber. It wasn't cold, but there was a slight chill on my skin. My breathing felt normal, but I had a nagging sensation in my stomach. I wasn't scared yet, just unsettled. I checked the walls more thoroughly. They had a polished look. In certain spots, I could see my reflection as I passed by. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but I noticed that whenever I turned around, the reflection on the wall seemed to lag by half a second. I thought it was a trick of the flashlight or maybe the angles of the surfaces. I tried not to think too much about it. I spent that first day collecting samples, taking measurements, and mapping the main chamber. When I got tired, I climbed back up to the surface, cooked a simple meal, and tried to sleep. But something kept me awake. My body felt exhausted, but my mind kept going back to those mirrored walls. I had this weird impression that the place was too pristine to be natural or even just a standard tomb. I forced myself to sleep, reminding myself that desert nights are cold and that I needed rest. The next morning I went back into the chamber early. I brought more tools, some extra lights, and a portable generator so I wouldn't rely on just my flashlight. I wanted to set up better illumination so I could document the walls more effectively. I hung up a few portable lamps and powered them on. The chamber lit up in a warm glow, and I could see the reflections more clearly. They were on nearly every smooth surface. At first glance, they seemed to show me walking around, picking up tools, and leaning down to study the ground. But then I noticed something off. When I turned my head, the reflection would sometimes keep looking forward for a moment. It was such a slight delay that I questioned my own eyes. I even blinked a few times trying to reset my vision, but the delay happened again. I began to get nervous. My chest felt tight, and my hands were clammy. I told myself it could be some optical effect caused by the type of rock in the walls. Maybe it was a property of the stone. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the job. I measured the chamber's dimensions. It was about 30 feet wide and 12 feet high, with a ceiling that arched slightly. The air inside was still and cool. There was a faint odor of dust and something else I couldn't identify. I was alone, so I tried to speak out loud a bit just to keep myself calm. I'd say things like, "Let's see if we can clear this section," or "I should check the corners for hidden passages." It helped me not to dwell on the strange behavior of my own reflection. After a few hours, I decided to take a break and eat. I sat on a flat rock near the entrance. That's when I noticed movement on the far side of the chamber. The reflections on the walls weren't just delayed anymore. They were moving in ways I wasn't. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. I walked toward one of the walls, and my reflection walked toward me. But his pace was different. My heart started pounding, and I could feel my throat tighten. I raised my right hand to rub my temple, but the reflection lifted its left hand. I stepped back, my legs trembling a bit. There was no logical explanation for this. I checked the edges of the wall, looking for any trick. The surface felt cold and smooth under my fingertips. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. It felt solid. I spun around to look at the other walls. I saw more reflections of myself, each one at a slightly different angle. As I moved, they moved, but not always in sync with me. Some tried to match my motions. Others stayed still, then rushed to catch up. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I felt lightheaded. I realized I might be in real danger, but I didn't know what was happening. I decided to back away from the walls and pack up my gear. As I gathered my equipment, I noticed one of the reflections was waving its arms above its head, almost like it was trying to warn me. I froze in place, my mind spinning. Was this a hallucination? Was I seeing things due to dehydration or exhaustion? I climbed back to the surface, telling myself I needed a rest. That night I drank a lot of water, ate some canned food, and tried not to panic. I turned over every possibility in my head. Maybe it was some form of reflective crystal that caused illusions. Maybe my mind was playing tricks because I was alone in the desert. But I'd never experienced anything like that before, and I'd been in worse conditions. My heart wouldn't settle. I kept thinking about those frantic gestures. The next day I tried to convince myself it would all make sense if I just examined the chamber more thoroughly. I set up a video camera on a tripod to see if I could record what was happening. The camera feed showed my movements, and in the shot I saw the walls behind me. When I moved my arm, I could see in real time that the reflections didn't match perfectly on the camera screen. There was a moment where the reflection stayed still while I walked forward. Then it stepped forward while I was standing still. I heard my voice tremble on camera as I asked, "What the hell is going on?" My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my ears. I kept filming. About an hour later, the generator sputtered and the lights flickered. I rushed to check the fuel. I had enough, but the generator was acting up. I gave it a few tries, and it roared back to life. During that downtime, the chamber was dimly lit by my flashlight again, and I saw my reflections in the flickering light. They were moving closer to me on the wall even though I was just standing there. One of them opened its mouth as if it were screaming, but I heard nothing. My stomach churned and my skin felt clammy. I stepped back, grabbed my gear, and ran toward the rope ladder. My foot slipped and I scraped my knee on the rough floor. A sharp pain shot up my leg, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I climbed up shaky and breathless. Outside, the desert sun felt brutal, but almost comforting compared to that underground space. I sat in the shade of my Jeep, pressing a wet cloth against the cut on my knee. My hands trembled, and my mind was racing. The feeling in my gut told me that there was something hostile or urgent about those reflections. They were trying to send a message. I replayed the scene in my head, especially the reflection that raised its arms like it were warning me. I decided to return once more, but carefully, and only for a short time, just to see if there was anything I missed. On the following morning, I went down again. This time I left the lights off for a moment, relying just on my flashlight. I scanned the walls one by one. My reflections were there, but some of them appeared to be gesturing for me to leave, pushing me away with both hands. Others seemed to point upward. My mouth went dry. My heart thumped so loudly it hurt. I whispered, "What is it? What do you want me to do?" I felt silly talking to my own reflection, but I was desperate. Then one reflection pressed its hands against the wall as though it were trapped. Another shook its head frantically. I caught a glimpse of one reflection grabbing its own arm. Then it turned to face me and pointed toward the ceiling. I turned my gaze upward. The chamber's ceiling had a series of hairline cracks I hadn't noticed before. Thought maybe the structure was unstable. I got a horrible feeling that the whole chamber could collapse. My mind jumped to the possibility that those reflections were somehow trying to tell me the place wasn't safe. Without wasting time, I checked some of the support areas around the walls. Some stones looked loose. A few were so brittle they crumbled when I poked them with my trowel. My stomach flipped. If those stones gave way, the entire ceiling could cave in. I decided I had enough proof to get out. I gathered my camera, tools and notes in a hurry. My muscles felt stiff and shaky. I stumbled toward the exit and paused one last time to look at the reflections. I saw them all in one line, facing me, arms raised in that same warning gesture. My hands shook as I put my foot on the first rung of the rope ladder. I climbed as fast as I could, trying to keep my breathing steady. Once I emerged onto the surface, I pulled out the rope ladder and covered the entrance with a plywood board and a tarp. I didn't want anyone else accidentally stumbling in without knowing the risk. My heart was still hammering, and my clothes were soaked in sweat. Over the next few days, I stayed around the site, camping a short distance away. I kept telling myself I should leave, but something about those reflections stuck with me. It felt like they were alive in some bizarre way. They seemed desperate to send a message. I believed it was about the instability of the structure or maybe something else underground, but I didn't feel safe going back down there. I tried to find local experts or other archaeologists to come see what I'd found, but communication was spotty in the remote desert. My satellite phone worked only intermittently, and emails took forever to send. I managed to reach a colleague in a nearby town, and he said he'd try to come in a week or so. I kept busy by documenting everything I remembered. I wrote down every detail of the reflections' movements, and even sketched the gestures I saw, though my drawing skills were mediocre. My hands wouldn't stop shaking when I thought about it. At night, I barely slept. I'd doze off, then jerk awake, imagining shadows moving around my tent. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw those reflections pounding on the walls as though they were stuck in a fictional space. After a few days, I heard a rumble in the distance. It wasn't thunder because the sky was clear. It sounded more like a minor earthquake or rock slide. I ran to the excavation area and found fresh cracks around the entrance. My gut told me that the entire chamber might have partially collapsed. I felt relieved that I wasn't down there, then at the same time I felt a pit in my stomach because I'd lost the chance to explore it further. I tried to peer inside, but dust and debris made it impossible. I decided not to risk it. If the structure was compromised, there was no way I was going in alone. So I packed up my main gear, took photographs of the collapsed entrance, and waited for my colleague. Deep down, I felt that the warnings from those reflections had saved me. I still couldn't wrap my head around how any of that was possible, but my body remembered the fear. My heart would race if I thought about those images too long. I decided to avoid explaining the reflections to anyone until I had more solid evidence. People would think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but as I looked out over the desert, the air so dry it hurt my nose. I felt thankful I got out in time. I never saw those reflections again. Some nights, though, I feel like I catch a glimpse of movement in my bathroom mirror or the windows of my truck. It's quick, just a fraction of a second. It makes my palms sweat. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I push it out of my head and try to focus on everyday life, but the memory never truly goes away. Whenever I think of that chamber, my chest tightens, and I feel that same sense of urgency I felt down there in the darkness. I won't deny it. I'm scared to find out what really happened beneath the desert. Maybe those reflections wanted to protect me from the collapse, or maybe they had another reason for trying to get my attention. Either way, I can't forget the look in their eyes. It felt like they were alive, separated from me by the thinnest wall imaginable. They seemed desperate, like they knew something I didn't. I wonder if I'll ever understand it. For now, I'm just glad to be out of that pit. I'm glad I paid attention to what I saw. I'm glad I listened to my own reflection. That's all I can say. I never expected a simple inheritance to flip my life upside down. When I learned about my distant uncle's old mansion, I figured it would be a quick in-and-out deal. I assumed I'd spend some time there, arrange the paperwork, and then sell the property. The condition was bizarre. I had to stay in the house for 30 days before I could put it on the market. I didn't think twice. It sounded like a mild inconvenience, but I was sure I could handle it. I've stayed in plenty of strange places while closing real estate deals. This one felt different from the start, though. The moment I walked inside, the air felt heavy. The wood floors creaked under my shoes, and the doors moaned on rusty hinges. Then, I noticed the mirrors. Instead of showing my own reflection, I saw a man in an old-fashioned office typing on a machine that looked older than anything I'd ever handled. That was just the first day. My name's Roger. I'm a real estate broker by trade. I've traveled all over flipping properties and managing rentals for clients who want to invest in something old and valuable. I'm usually comfortable in dusty attics, moldy basements, and abandoned farmhouses. I know what to expect in forgotten homes. But this place was different. It felt occupied, even though I was the only living person walking around inside. When I arrived on the first day, I parked my car in a circular driveway. The yard was overgrown with weeds. A few of the hedges looked like they'd been trimmed sometime in the last decade, but not recently. The mansion itself stood 3 stories tall, with stone walls and tall windows. There was a wraparound porch with rotting boards. The front door was massive, with a bronze doorknob shaped like a lion's head. I turned the knob, stepped inside, and felt a rush of stale air. It smelled like old leather, dust, and the faint odor of mildew. I walked through the foyer and saw a grand staircase leading up. There were dark hallways on either side, lined with doors. The floors creaked with every step. I dropped my bags near the front entrance. My plan was to pick a bedroom on the 2nd floor and stay there while I did a quick inspection of the property. I wasn't scared then. I just thought this would be another weird old house that needed some upgrades. But something changed when I noticed the mirrors. There was a large mirror in the foyer, probably about 6 feet tall, with a heavy gold frame. I looked at it. Instead of my own face, I saw the outline of a man wearing suspenders and a fedora. He was sitting at a desk in what looked like a 1920s office. I could see a green banker's lamp on the desk, a typewriter, and stacks of paper. The man was typing. He never looked up. I blinked a few times. I figured I was overtired or stressed out. But when I stepped closer, it didn't go away. It was still there, like I was watching a scene from another time. I touched the mirror's surface. It felt solid and cool. I heard a faint clacking sound, like keys on a typewriter. Then I jumped back, startled by my own reaction. I stared at the mirror for a few more seconds. The man kept typing. I walked into the living room, trying to shake off the weird feeling. There was another mirror there, above the fireplace. This one was smaller, rectangular, and dusty. I wiped the surface with my sleeve, peering in. I saw the same scene, the same office, the same man typing away. We stepped back, my heart pounding, swallowed hard. I tried to tell myself it was a reflection from somewhere else in the house, maybe a strange optical trick. But deep down, I knew that made no sense. The furniture behind him didn't match anything I'd seen in the mansion. It looked like it was from another time. I went upstairs to pick a room. The 2nd floor hallway was dark. The light switch near the stairs did nothing, so I opened a few doors looking for a comfortable bedroom. The furniture was covered in sheets and dust floated in the air, making my nose tickle. I finally found one bedroom with a decent bed frame and a mattress that didn't look too lumpy. I dropped my bags on the floor and checked the adjoining bathroom. The plumbing made loud groans when I turned on the faucet, but at least water came out. It looked rusty at first, then ran clearer after a few seconds. I splashed some water on my face. It felt cold and woke me up a bit. I looked up at the bathroom mirror. Same scene. The man was typing, completely focused on his work. I felt an uneasy shiver crawl up my spine, but I decided to ignore it for now and went back to the hallway. I wanted to open all the doors to get a sense of the place. Some rooms were locked, but most opened without trouble. One room looked like a library. It was filled with bookshelves and dusty tomes. There were comfortable chairs and a large desk. No modern devices at all. Another room had old portraits on the walls. I recognized one portrait as my distant uncle, based on photos I'd seen. He wore an old-fashioned suit, and his eyes seemed to follow me as I moved across the room. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. The 3rd floor had a few guest rooms and a large storage area. I found a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. The doorknob wouldn't budge, and I decided not to force it yet. I wasn't sure what I'd find inside. I figured I had 30 days to figure everything out. That night, I cooked a quick dinner in the outdated kitchen. The gas stove worked, though it hissed loudly when I turned the knob. The refrigerator was ancient, but I had brought a cooler with some basic supplies, so I didn't rely on it. I sat at the dining table, chewing on a sandwich. The only sounds were the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of the house settling. I went to sleep early. It was a restless night. I heard creaks, taps, and a few soft thumps. Each time I jolted awake, my heart pounding. I kept turning on my flashlight and pointing it around the room, expecting to see someone standing by the window or in the corner. There was never anyone there. The mirrors in the bedroom and bathroom stayed covered by sheets. I couldn't stand seeing that same typing man again. The second day, I woke up feeling stiff. My back ached from the old mattress. I got dressed and went downstairs, thinking I'd look for some coffee. As I passed the foyer, I noticed pieces of paper on the floor. They looked yellowed, like old parchment. I picked one up. There were typed words on it in black ink. The text read like a journal entry. It described a person discovering a hidden room in the mansion. The text referred to complicated plans for a device. My eyes scanned the words quickly. It said something about harnessing energy from the house's structure. I couldn't understand the details, but it was clear that whoever typed this was obsessed with the mansion's design. I gathered the pages and placed them on a side table. I wondered if they had fallen from an upstairs closet, but they looked freshly typed, not like they'd been sitting around for decades. I remembered the man in the mirrors. Was he the one typing these pages? It made no logical sense, but I couldn't explain it any other way. I checked the mirrors again. He was still there, typing. I knocked on the glass a few times, feeling stupid. He didn't react. He never seemed to look up or change pace. That day, I searched the mansion more thoroughly. I opened every unlocked cabinet, looked behind shelves, and peered into closets. I found old clothes, letters, and some dusty antiques. I started to get a sense of the house's layout. The rooms were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a maze. Some doors connected in odd ways, leading me in circles. Late in the afternoon, I found a small door tucked behind a large tapestry in the library. It led to a narrow staircase going down. I followed it carefully, shining my flashlight on each step. The stairs creaked and felt a bit unstable, but I made it to the bottom. There was a small room with stone walls. It smelled damp. I saw shelves filled with old notebooks, glass beakers, and metal parts that looked like they belonged in a workshop. There was a workbench in the corner. On it, I found a half-assembled machine. It had gears, switches, and wires. It reminded me of a large mechanical device from an old lab, but I couldn't tell what it did. I heard a faint scraping noise. It sounded like metal against stone. I turned around, my heart thudding in my chest. Nothing was there. I stood still for a few moments, listening. The only sound was the drip of water somewhere in the corner. I felt a chill crawl over my arms. I backed out of the room and closed the door behind me, deciding it was better to come back another time. Every morning I found more pages scattered around the house. I started collecting them in a folder. They told a story of a man who built the mansion with a specific goal, to capture some kind of energy from the people who lived there. The text didn't explain how. It only described an experiment that involved focusing on reflective surfaces. The pages mentioned the word mirrors many times. They also described plans for a device that would direct some force toward a hidden chamber in the mansion. I felt uncomfortable reading this. I didn't know if it was a hoax or something my uncle had been involved in, but the pages kept appearing day after day, usually in places where I couldn't miss them, like on my bed or on the kitchen counter. They were always typed in that same old-fashioned style. By the end of the first week, I was on edge. I jumped at every strange sound. At night, I blocked the mirrors with sheets, but I still sensed a presence. My hands shook when I tried to open locked doors or check the corners of each room. Sometimes I felt short of breath, as if the house was pressing down on me. I started skipping meals because I was too nervous to stay in the kitchen for long. The gas stove's hiss made me worry about leaks. The overhead light flickered. Everything felt unreliable. On the 10th day, I decided to confront the locked door on the 3rd floor. I had a ring of old keys I'd found in one of the desks. I tried them one by one. Eventually the lock clicked and the door opened. The room was small, dusty, and smelled of mothballs. An antique vanity stood against the far wall, its mirror facing the door. As soon as I walked in, I saw the man typing. The reflection showed me a closer look at him. He was older than I had realized, with lines on his face, intense eyes, and a thin mustache. I stepped closer. I almost thought I heard the typewriter louder in that room. I could see the shape of the keys moving under his fingers. Then I saw there were more papers scattered around the floor behind the vanity. I picked them up and read them. They mentioned a final phase of the mansion's purpose. The writer had discovered a way to trap the essence of anyone who spent a full month in the house. My stomach tightened, my hands sweated. The pages ended abruptly with a line about a link between the writer and the occupant. I left the room in a hurry, locking it behind me. I went to the bathroom and ran the water. I splashed my face and stared into the mirror without covering it first. As soon as I looked, I saw him again typing away. I shouted, "Who are you?" My voice echoed in the empty bathroom. The man didn't move. I pounded the sink with my fist, frustrated and scared. My chest felt tight. My pulse raced. I ran out of the bathroom and sat on the floor in the hallway. I tried to calm my breathing by taking slow, steady gulps of air. On the 15th day, I woke up and found an entire pile of pages in the foyer. They were arranged neatly on top of a small side table. I read through them quickly. They described the final nights of a previous resident who had tried to destroy the mirrors. This resident broke several of them with a hammer, but the reflections kept returning in other mirrors around the house. The text said that the house's design had locked in some force that wouldn't let go until it had completed its purpose. My palms grew clammy as I read this. I looked up and saw my own reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time in days, I saw myself. My hair was messy, and my eyes looked sunken from lack of sleep. There was no sign of the man typing. This vanished as soon as I blinked. Then the reflection snapped back to the 1920s. The man kept typing. The next few days felt like a blur. I spent most of my time pacing the floors, looking for more typed pages and trying to sleep enough to keep my sanity. My body felt weak, and my thoughts raced. I checked the calendar constantly, counting down the days until I could legally sell the house. I told myself that all I needed to do was make it to day 30. Then I could leave and never look back. On the 20th day, I got so frustrated that I tried removing the mirrors from the walls. I took them down, carried them to the garage, and covered them with blankets. But when I turned around, the reflection was still visible in other shiny surfaces like windows and even the polished metal of the doorknobs. I couldn't escape it. I felt trapped. On the 25th day, I tried spending as much time outside the house as possible. I'd walk the grounds, check the yard, and look for anything to keep me out of those halls. But the reflection followed me in windows, car mirrors, anything reflective. I even saw that man typing in a puddle of rainwater on the driveway. That night, I barely slept. I heard the house groan and felt the floor vibrate once or twice, like something was shifting underneath. On the 30th day, I woke up before sunrise. My body ached, my head hurt, and I walked around searching for any final pages. Sure enough, I found a few in the kitchen. They described how the occupant had to comply with the house's timeline. They said that on the final night, the occupant would see the office empty, and the typewriter would stop. That would signal the completion of the cycle. I realized I hadn't looked at a mirror yet that morning, so I lifted the sheet off the mirror near the kitchen. The office was empty. The typewriter sat on the desk with a blank page. No man in sight. I felt a surge of relief. I hurried to gather my things, ready to leave as soon as the 30 days were up. I loaded my car and closed the front door behind me, turning the large key in the lock. As I walked toward my car, I glanced at the side mirror. I saw only my reflection. I felt a wave of relief. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. My hands were still shaking, but I felt a strange calm. I left the mansion behind me, determined to sell it as soon as I had a buyer. That's the end of my time in that place. I still don't understand exactly what happened. I'm not sure if I want to. I followed the instructions in my uncle's will. I stayed the full 30. Now I can put the mansion up for sale. I just won't mention the mirrors, the pages, or the typing man. If someone else wants that property, they'll let them discover its secrets on their own. All I know is that when I look at my bathroom mirror at home, I see my own face staring back at me. That's enough for me. I don't want any more surprises. I never thought an old Latin manuscript could mess with my head. But that's exactly what happened. I remember how it started. I was just browsing through a dusty used bookstore on a Saturday afternoon, hoping to find some obscure reference for my medieval history class. I didn't want anything special. I just wanted a book that might spark a new idea for my lectures. I saw this battered codex in the corner. Its leather cover had ugly stains, and its spine looked half torn. It had a faded inscription that I couldn't make out right away. I felt a strange pull. I picked it up and opened the first page. The letters were in Latin, but the script looked older than anything I'd seen before. I thought it might be from the 14th century or maybe even earlier. I bought it without a second thought. I took it home and put it on my desk. My office is small, with a narrow window that faces another building. There's barely any sunlight during the day. I like it quiet. I had a half-finished coffee on the table, and the smell was sour because it was old. I didn't mind. I placed the codex beside my laptop and ran my hand over the front cover. The leather felt rough and grainy. There was a faint smell like mold and old parchment. I felt a little excited, like I'd stumbled on a hidden treasure. I tried to read a few pages. The handwriting was cramped, and some letters faded into the background. I recognized some words that related to religious rites, maybe references to medieval theology. I struggled with the grammar because it wasn't standard classical Latin. It seemed more like a medieval variant with weird abbreviations. I wrote down some notes in my notebook, labeling them carefully. Page numbers, partial translations, question marks. Everything felt normal. That night, I slept poorly and had weird dreams about shifting letters. I would see a sentence in Latin, and then it would rearrange itself into new words. I woke up sweaty, with tangled sheets around my legs and a pounding heart. I got up, drank some water, and tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination. The next morning I went to my desk and noticed the codex was open to a different page than I remembered. I figured I might have left it that way. I looked at my notes and saw some strange additions. Lines of text I didn't remember writing were there, mixed with my own handwriting. It said something like Hoc est Initium, repeated in different spots. I felt a jolt of confusion. My handwriting was on the page, but the phrases looked alien. I couldn't recall writing them. I thought maybe I wrote it half asleep, or in some absent-minded state, and shrugged it off. But I felt a slight itch of worry. I pressed on and tried to translate more of the manuscript, but the words seemed jumbled. I remembered a sentence from the day before, but now it was different. It was as if the letters had shuffled themselves overnight. I wondered if I'd misread them before. I looked at my notes, and they didn't match anymore. My heart started to race. I felt a tightness in my stomach. I tried to stay logical, so I checked the text carefully, word by word. Some passages were still the same, but others were completely off from my initial notes. I couldn't find a rational explanation, but I told myself I was just tired. Later that evening, I typed an email to a colleague. It was supposed to be a quick note about a departmental meeting. I started typing in English. After a few lines, I glanced at the screen and saw I'd typed half of it in Latin, not modern Latin. It looked like the same old style from the codex. I jerked back from the keyboard. My hands were clammy. My fingers shook. I tried to delete it, but my computer froze for a second, then went back to normal. I deleted the text, rewrote the email, and forced myself to keep it simple. The entire time, my pulse thudded in my ears. I realized something was wrong. I went back to the codex and tried to examine the ink, the pages, the binding. I wondered if there was some hallucinogenic fungus or a chemical that could affect me. I didn't see anything obvious, but the musty smell got stronger. I started sneezing a lot. I felt dizzy. I put the book inside a plastic bag and left it on a shelf. I tried to avoid it for a few days, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. Oh, I felt drawn to it. I kept thinking about those rearranged phrases, the lines I couldn't remember writing. One night, I decided to try again. I took the codex to my living room, where I have a stronger lamp. I sat on the couch, turned on a reading light, and opened the plastic bag. The smell was worse. It made my eyes water. Still, I opened the cover and flipped through to the first page with text. The script looked different from before. Some words were spaced out oddly, while others were bunched up as if they'd slid across the page. I put on some gloves and held the magnifying glass close. I saw that the ink lines didn't have the usual cracks you'd expect from old writing. Instead, they looked fresh in some spots, faded in others. It was like it was alive, shifting. My throat went dry, and I felt a wave of nausea. I stopped reading and tried to calm down, telling myself I was just imagining things. I took pictures with my phone, planning to compare them the next day. I snapped clear shots of several pages and noted the page numbers on a sticky note. Then I put the codex back in the plastic bag and set it on a high shelf in my closet. I closed the door. I tried to watch TV for a while to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to those pages. The following morning, I checked the photos on my phone.
They showed the text as I'd seen it.
I grabbed the codex from the closet, opened it to the same pages, and found that they looked different again. Some words were reversed, while others were on different lines. I flipped back and forth, comparing them to my phone's images. There was no doubt they had changed. My chest tightened, and I breathed harder. My forehead felt cold. I placed the codex on the table. My hands shook. I didn't want to admit this was real, but I couldn't deny it anymore. I had physical evidence. Over the next week, I tried to keep a rational approach. I recorded every change. I took more pictures, made more notes, and emailed them to myself. But the strangest part was how my own writing got corrupted. I'd opened my notebook and see lines of medieval Latin sprinkled among my normal English notes. I didn't remember writing them. Some nights I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and find myself at the desk, the codex open in front of me. I never remembered getting out of bed. I'd see fresh notations in the margins, my handwriting, but words that made no sense to me in the moment. I started having trouble communicating. I'd go to campus, try to give a lecture, and halfway through a sentence, I'd slip into Latin. My students looked confused. I'd catch myself and switch back, but I felt disoriented. My department chair asked if I was feeling all right. I lied and said I was just dealing with a cold. I tried to speak slower, choose simpler words, and keep everything straightforward. I felt a constant tension in my throat, like I was on the verge of losing control. Well, I also noticed my typing changed. Text messages to friends had random Latin phrases. I'd send a message about meeting for coffee, and it would come out with Venom Cito at the end. My friend asked if I was playing some kind of prank. I said it was autocorrect acting up, but I knew that was a lie. I tried turning off all autocorrect functions, but the problem continued. My phone's text predictions started suggesting Latin words I'd never typed before. I felt trapped. Sometimes I slammed the laptop shut and walked away. My scalp tingled, my palms got sweaty, my breathing went shallow. I felt fear, but I also felt an odd urge to keep reading. I couldn't ignore the codex. It was like an itch I had to scratch. I needed to see what new changes had appeared. I needed to figure out the meaning behind it. Each night the text rearranged itself into new messages. I tried to translate them piece by piece. Most of them referenced ancient rituals or instructions for prayers I'd never heard of. Some passages mentioned hidden knowledge, while others seemed like random words. Every time I tried to make sense of it, my thoughts would drift and I'd find myself writing more notes in Latin. I felt a throbbing behind my eyes. My vision blurred sometimes. The words on my laptop screen flickered. I'd close my eyes, rub them, and open them again. I started leaving lights on at night. I couldn't sleep well in the dark. My body was exhausted. My neck and back ached. My stomach churned whenever I thought about that codex. But I kept going back to it. I felt compelled. My routine became distorted. I'd spend hours analyzing 1 or 2 pages only to find them changed the next morning. I took breaks to shower and eat, but I rushed through those tasks. I didn't care about anything else. I emailed a professor I trust in a different state. I sent him a few photos of the codex. I tried to ask for help, but when I reread my own email, I noticed half of it was in Latin. It sounded frantic and disjointed. It also included some lines that referenced my confusion and fear, but it jumped around in grammar. I felt embarrassed. I waited for a reply, but nothing came. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. I felt alone. One evening I decided to lock the codex in a safe in my closet. I punched in a code I'd never used before, something random, so I wouldn't open it easily. I wanted to block myself from it. I tried to read a normal paperback novel to clear my head, but my eyes saw Latin words in the normal English sentences. I flipped out. I threw the book on the floor. My breathing turned shallow. I felt a tightness in my chest. I paced around my apartment. My head pounded. I put the phone down. I opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and tried to drink, but my hands trembled so much that I spilled half of it on the floor. I wiped the spill with a towel, then decided to turn on some music. I needed noise. My apartment felt too quiet. I sat on the couch, stared at the blank TV screen for a while, and breathed slowly. My heart pounded against my ribs. After an hour, I calmed down enough to feel a bit tired. I went to bed, leaving the codex locked away. In the middle of the night, I jerked awake. My throat was dry. My head pounded. I realized I was sitting at my desk, my hands on the keyboard. My laptop screen showed a document filled with Latin text. My arms felt stiff, as if I'd been typing for hours. I looked at the clock. It was 3. I had no idea how I got there. The safe was open. The codex was on the desk, too. My stomach twisted in knots. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I slammed the codex shut and shoved it aside. I typed random letters on the keyboard, trying to see if the laptop was stuck in some weird mode. I typed in English just fine, but the document was still there, lines and lines of medieval Latin. My name was at the top, typed in bold letters. I had no memory of creating that file. I printed a page from the document. I held it in my hands and stared at the crisp black letters. It looked like something from a century-old library, except it came from my modern printer. I felt lightheaded. My eyes blurred. I stumbled to the kitchen and gulped down more water. I splashed some on my face, trying to ground myself. I could feel my heart pounding fast and irregular. My thoughts darted around. I decided I needed help. I didn't know from whom, but I couldn't keep this to myself. I tried calling a colleague in the middle of the night. I got his voicemail. I left a short message saying I had an emergency and needed him to call me back. I didn't mention the codex or the Latin. I sounded nervous enough as it was. After that, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, staring at the locked codex. I still don't know how I opened the safe, nor do I remember the combination I used. The next morning, I found new texts on my phone. They were messages I'd apparently sent to various colleagues. They were all in Latin and looked formal, almost like some official document. I had no idea what they said exactly. My chest felt tight, and my mouth went dry. I didn't even know how to begin explaining this. I wanted to delete them, but I also wanted to keep them as proof that I wasn't imagining anything. My phone battery was nearly dead. I plugged it in and just stared at the screen at those lines of text. Now I can't ignore it. The manuscript changes every night. My handwriting shifts into Latin at random moments, and my typing does the same. I try to fight it, but I can't control my fingers. The tension in my body is constant. My breath is short most of the day, and my eyes sting because I barely sleep. When I do sleep, I have no idea where I'll wake up or what I'll be doing. Everything feels fragile. I keep the codex locked away, but it doesn't matter. It reaches me somehow, and it's changing me. I can't deny that anymore. It's right in front of me in my own words and in my own hands, and I don't know how to stop it. I first noticed something off during my 3rd week on the job. I work as a night guard at a small art museum downtown. It's usually quiet. I spend most of my shift walking up and down halls, checking doors, making sure no one breaks in. But one night around 2 a.m. I saw a painting that seemed different. I was doing my normal round, shining my flashlight on the frames, and I could have sworn the person in the portrait was facing the wrong way. It was a painting of a man in an old military uniform, and I remember seeing him at orientation. He was turned to the left in the painting, but now he was turned to the right. I shook my head and told myself I was tired. I kept walking. The next night, I tried to ignore it. Everything looked normal in the hallway, but halfway through my shift, I got this feeling in my gut. I can describe it well except to say it felt like someone was watching me. When I turned around, the painting of that old soldier was in its usual spot, but there was something about the soldier's eyes that felt more intense. I leaned in. My flashlight hit his face. His eyes didn't move, but I still got the sense he was staring right at me, like there was a real person behind the canvas. I checked the label under the frame and read it again. Nothing seemed out of place, except that the night before I knew his posture had been off, but now he looked exactly like I remembered from orientation. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that maybe I'd just been mistaken, or maybe it was a different painting with a similar figure. But the next night I paid extra attention to the entire hallway. That's when I noticed an even stranger detail. In a big painting of a formal banquet scene, there was a woman in a black dress who wasn't in the same spot as before. She'd been seated at the far right table, and now she was closer to the center. I double-checked the other figures around her. They were all in a slightly different arrangement. The man with the red sash used to be behind her, and now he was to her left. It made no sense. Paintings don't just rearrange themselves. I tried to keep my cool. I did my routine. I locked the doors, walked through each gallery, and fought the urge to keep staring at the paintings. My stomach twisted whenever I got near them, though. Something felt wrong in that hallway. Then I thought I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. I kept hearing it, just a slight rustle like clothes brushing together, every time I passed near those suspicious paintings. On my 4th week, I decided I needed solid proof. I brought my phone with me on my rounds and took quick photos of a few paintings. I wanted to compare them the next night. When I came back the following evening, I looked at the painting of the banquet scene. The woman in black was even closer to the center now, and the red-sashed man was standing next to her chair. I flipped open my phone to compare the photo from the night before. It confirmed I wasn't imagining things. The positions were changing, and I had pictures to prove it. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to think of how to deal with this. My first instinct was to tell someone, but it was 3 in the morning and I didn't have many options. I decided I'd show my supervisor during daytime hours, but I also felt uneasy about revealing what I knew. Part of me was worried I'd get fired for sounding crazy. That same night, I noticed something else. There was a big glass display case in the lobby that held some older sculptures. When I walked past it, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, but it didn't look right. My reflection was at an odd angle. My body was facing forward in reality, but in the glass I looked slightly turned. At first I laughed at myself, figuring it was just some distortion or weird glare from the overhead light. But the next time I passed by that glass, I saw more than just my reflection. I saw the outline of the museum's hallway, but it looked darker. The walls in the reflection had a different set of paintings. And then I saw a shape move behind me in that reflection, something that wasn't there in the real hallway. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. I took a step closer. The reflection didn't match reality. It was like looking into a parallel corridor with the same general layout but different paintings on the walls. Instead of modern art pieces, I saw older portraits, and one of them was that old soldier. I recognized his face, but it was on a smaller canvas. Then I leaned even closer and noticed that I could see the soldier's hand flexing, like a real hand moving under a thick glove. I blinked hard to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The soldier's hand in the reflection moved again. A chill spread across my shoulders. I panicked and backed away. I paced around the lobby for a minute, trying to calm down. My mind was racing. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I needed to figure out what was going on. I walked back to the glass case, stared at my reflection, and reached out. My fingers touched the cool surface of the glass. I tapped it. It sounded solid, but as I moved my hand slowly over it, the reflection seemed to shift. It looked like there was a ripple, almost like water near the bottom edge. I crouched and touched that spot. My hand sank through the glass. The sensation was the strangest. My eyes saw a solid surface, but my hand felt a soft, cool resistance, like sticking my hand into thick gel. My chest tightened and my breathing grew shaky. I pulled my hand back in a rush. My skin was dry. There was no trace of anything on it. A pounding started in my temples. My mind screamed at me to walk away, but I couldn't. I had to know what would happen if I went all the way in. I glanced around the lobby, making sure no one else was there. It was past midnight, so of course I was alone. I looked back at that ripple, put my hand on it again, and pushed forward. My hand disappeared up to the wrist. My arm felt cool, almost numb, but I didn't feel pain. So, I took a deep breath, squeezed my eyes shut, and stepped through the glass. I felt a rush of cold air slide over me. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was standing in that parallel corridor. The lights were dim, and everything around me felt thicker. The air smelled like old fabric and paint. My footsteps sounded hollow, like I was walking on an old wooden floor, even though I could see the museum's marble tiles. I stood in front of another painting, the one with the old soldier. He was right there, and for a moment I thought he was breathing. The angle of his chest seemed to move up and down very slightly. I stepped back. My heart thumped so loud I could barely think. I turned around to see if I could get back to the real hallway, and I saw the same glass display case behind me. I could see my real-world reflection in it, slightly distorted. I felt sweat rolling down my sides. I needed to leave, so I did. I walked back through the glass, and the moment I emerged, I almost fell forward. My muscles felt heavy, and I grabbed the edge of the case to steady myself. I noticed that the museum felt different. The air was cooler, and the overhead lights flickered for a second. Then, I heard a soft scrape behind me. My nerves went on edge. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corridor. For a second I saw a figure move around the corner. It looked like someone in a long coat. I moved after it, calling out, "Hello?" But there was no response. When I reached the corner, the corridor was empty. A light overhead buzzed. My pulse was still racing. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept hearing footsteps. I turned the corner a few times, trying to catch whoever it was, but I found nothing. I checked all the doors to make sure they were locked. Nothing was out of place, but the sense that someone was in there with me never went away. In the morning, I clocked out and went home. I spent the entire day trying to decide if I should quit. My nerves were shot. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I felt nauseous every time I closed my eyes. But a part of me couldn't let go of that experience. I needed answers, so I went back to work the next night. The moment I walked in, I saw that the paintings were changed again. The soldier painting was missing from its original spot. In its place was a blank canvas with faint outlines of a uniform. It was like the soldier had stepped out. My stomach clenched. I hurried to the big banquet scene. The woman in black was gone too. Several other figures in that painting were in different spots, and one chair was empty. I went straight to the lobby and stared at the glass display case. My reflection looked normal now. No strange corridor behind me. I tapped the surface in different spots, but it felt solid. I couldn't push through. Confused, I walked around for a while, looking for any sign of the missing figures. That's when I saw movement near one of the sculpture halls. I turned my flashlight and sure enough I spotted the soldier in the distance. He was wearing the same old military uniform, but now it looked like worn fabric instead of paint. He moved quickly around a corner, and I chased after him. I caught a glimpse of him near an exit door. He had a stern face, and he seemed tense, like he was on guard duty. He looked over his shoulder at me, then disappeared through the door. I rushed to the door, thinking I'd catch him outside, but when I opened it, the parking lot was empty. The night air was cold, and I stood there feeling lost. I closed the door and stepped back inside. My nerves were on edge, and I didn't have a clue what to do. I walked around the museum's perimeter, trying to find him, but he was gone. An hour later, I heard soft footsteps upstairs. My legs felt heavy as I climbed the staircase. At the top, near the modern art section, I found the woman in black standing by a window. She didn't look at me. She was staring at the city lights almost like she was seeing them for the first time. She reached out and touched the glass. I heard a slight squeak as her glove rubbed against it. She was solid and real. Her dress made a faint rustling sound when she moved. I didn't know what to say, but I tried to speak. "Mom, you're not supposed to be here," I muttered, my mouth dry. She turned around and her eyes met mine. She looked more shocked than afraid, like she couldn't believe I was talking to her. She took a slow step backward, turned, and walked away. I followed, calling after her, but she disappeared through a staff-only door. When I opened it, the hallway beyond was empty. I felt sweat prickling my forehead. My head throbbed. The rest of the night was a blur. I saw occasional movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned, I didn't see any of them. It was clear these figures had escaped from their paintings. I also had this gut feeling that each time I stepped through that glass, I let someone else out. That was my guess, and I hated how helpless it made me feel. I spent the next few nights trying to fix it. I'd circled a museum looking for any sign that the glass might let me back in. I thought maybe I could go inside again and somehow bring them back, but the display case stayed firm. There was no ripple. I tried tapping it the same way as before. I tried focusing on my reflection. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, I kept spotting figures roaming in distant corridors. They didn't bother me, but they seemed lost or maybe curious. I saw a woman in a white lace dress examining a sculpture of a horse. I saw a man in a dark coat standing near the cafe, looking at the vending machines like he was trying to figure out how they worked. One night, I almost cornered the soldier in the main lobby, but he slipped away. I was starting to think they weren't hostile. They didn't seem aggressive. They just seemed like they didn't belong. I wanted to ask them what they wanted, but I couldn't get close enough. And I sure wasn't going to call the cops or anything. How would I explain that? Eventually, I tried an experiment. I stood in front of the display case and looked at my reflection. I said out loud, "I want to come in. I won't hurt anyone." My voice trembled. I felt stupid talking to my own reflection, but I kept trying. On the 5th attempt, the glass rippled at the bottom again, just for a split second. I quickly shoved my hand through and forced myself inside. The cold sensation came back and I stepped into that strange corridor again. I looked around. The paintings on the walls were half finished. Some of the colors looked muted. The door at the far end was open, letting in a dim light. I walked toward it, hoping I'd find a way to bring back the missing figures. Then I heard a noise behind me. When I turned, I saw the soldier. He was inside this painted world. He didn't seem pleased to see me. He stepped forward and I took a few steps back. I could see the tension in his posture. He raised a gloved hand as if telling me to stop. I felt a chill run across my neck, but I raised my hands to show I wasn't a threat. He took a step closer, reached out and pressed his hand against the same glass portal. Instantly, I saw another ripple. Then he slipped through into my world again, leaving me behind. I tried to follow him, but the glass went solid. I banged my fist against it, feeling a wave of panic. I ran down the corridor looking for another way out. Every passage I found led back to more empty holes. Finally, I returned to the same display case. I placed my palms on the glass and concentrated on what was happening outside. I could see my own reflection in the museum, faint but visible. My chest tightened. I closed my eyes and thought about stepping back through. At first, it didn't work. I was trapped in that silent space. Then, with one final push, I forced my body forward, and I tumbled through. I landed on the lobby floor in a heap. My arms and legs tingled, and I heard a faint hum in my ears. When I stood up, my body felt heavy, and my clothes were slightly damp with sweat. I saw scuff marks on the marble where my shoes had dragged. I looked around. The museum was still, the lights were normal, but then I heard movement near the staircase. I saw at least 3 or 4 figures wandering around. The soldier, the woman in black, the woman in white, lace, and a man in an old-fashioned suit. They were all looking at different parts of the museum. They seemed transfixed by everything, like travelers in a new city. I realized each time I crossed over, I released another figure. I leaned against the wall, breathing hard. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How would I get them back inside their paintings? Could I ever seal that portal? And what if more figures emerged? I decided to stay on as the night guard, at least for the time being. I do my rounds every night and watch these figures roaming the corridors. They don't talk to me, and I don't approach them. I don't feel safe trying to force them back. Sometimes they vanish into corners, and I don't see them again for hours. But I know they're there, exploring, learning, doing whatever it is they do when I'm not watching. So now I stay alert. I avoid the glass display case and definitely don't try to go back through it. I haven't told anyone. I just keep my head down, do my job, and mark the hours until morning. I don't sleep well. I see those shapes behind my eyelids whenever I close them. But at least no one's been hurt, and I haven't seen any major damage in the museum. I'm just hoping it stays that way. I'm telling you all this because I can't carry it alone anymore. I still don't know how it started. I don't know why I can go through the glass or how these painted people come out. I only know that every time I risk crossing over, one more painting gets empty. And maybe one day the entire museum will be filled with people who were once trapped on canvas, all wandering around at night when no one else is there. Until then, I'll keep walking my rounds, flashlight in hand, and pretend I don't see anything strange. That's the best solution I have right now. If anyone notices the paintings changing during the day, they haven't said anything yet. Maybe they never will, but I know the truth, and it weighs on me every night. I still remember the chill in the air when I first laid eyes on that mirror. My flashlight beam caught its dull surface at the back of a cramped cavern, and for a split second I thought it was just a rock formation. But the shape was too smooth, and it reflected my light in a strange way. I'd been exploring old sites for a month, gathering notes on rituals that local communities had once practiced. I wasn't expecting to find something like that tucked away behind layers of dust and cobwebs. It looked ancient, with markings along the rim that I couldn't read. As I stepped closer, my heart pounded harder. I'm not usually spooked by random objects. I've seen old idols, worn-out figurines, and touched relics that felt cold to the touch. This mirror, though, felt different. Its presence made my skin crawl. I'm an anthropologist by trade, so I'm used to handling fragile items. I ran my gloved fingertips along the edge. The metal was tarnished but solid. There were odd engravings around the border, almost like small geometric shapes arranged in a circle. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it might be just a decorative piece used in ceremonies. The reflective surface was scratched and dull, but I could still see my face in it, though my features looked warped and faint. As I studied it, I noticed my breathing getting faster. I told myself it was just the claustrophobia of being in a damp cave, but something about that piece unsettled me. When I brought the mirror back home, I wiped it down and tried to clean some of the grime from its surface. My apartment isn't large, I live alone, so I set the mirror up in my living room on a small table near the wall. I wanted to examine it under better lighting. I had a basic lamp shining down on it, and I jotted down observations in my notebook. The markings around the rim still puzzled me, and I planned to look them up in my reference materials. After a while, I got up to go to the kitchen. It was pretty late, maybe close to midnight, and I was hungry. I remember walking past the mirror and catching my reflection. I looked tired. Then I stepped away, headed to the kitchen, and something felt off. My muscles tensed. I turned back to the living room and saw the mirror from the corner of my eye. It seemed like my reflection stayed there just a little longer than it should have. I shook my head and blamed my own fatigue. That night I found myself waking up every couple of hours. I'd roll over in bed, aware of a dull ache in my chest. I kept thinking about that moment in the living room. I kept picturing my reflection not following me right away. It made me sweat. By morning I convinced myself I must have been half asleep and just imagined it. I got up, took a shower, and tried to ignore the anxiety I felt about going back to that mirror. I spent the day comparing the engraved patterns to some references online. None of the usual scripts matched. The shapes seemed unique, like a series of triangles and intersecting lines arranged in a spiral. Every time I glanced at the mirror, I noticed small details I hadn't seen before, tiny nicks in the metal or faint streaks on the reflective surface. Around dinner time, I stood up to stretch and approach the mirror. My reflection stared back at me. I lifted a hand to rub the back of my neck. The reflection did it too, but with a slight delay, less than a second, but I saw it. My hand touched my neck first, and then I saw my reflection's hand move. I froze. My heartbeat thumped against my ribs. My scalp tingled. I thought maybe there was something about the old surface that created a lag, like a trick of the eyes. I tried flicking my fingers. Again, there was a delay. I took a deep breath, then took a step back. I watched as my reflection took a moment longer to step back. The delay was there, small but noticeable. I thought about calling a friend or colleague to show them, but I felt stupid. I figured I should record it, so I grabbed my phone. I propped it up on a stack of books, pointed it at me in the mirror, and tried to replicate the delay. I raised my right hand while looking at the mirror. The reflection raised its hand, however. On the phone screen, I couldn't see any delay. It looked perfectly normal in the video. That freaked me out more. I realized this delay was only visible to me in real time. The recording showed everything in sync. I must have replayed that video 5 times, hoping to spot a glitch. There was nothing. My reflection on the screen moved exactly as I did. That night I left the living room lights on. I couldn't bring myself to turn them off and walk past that mirror in the dark. I tried to do some reading in bed but couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the open doorway leading to the living room. I kept imagining that if I got up and peeked around the corner, I'd see my reflection looking at me from the mirror. I told myself I was being irrational. I'm a researcher. I deal with facts, documentation, and physical evidence. But none of that helped with the lump in my throat or the tightness in my stomach. By the 3rd day, I noticed the delay getting worse. It wasn't just a fraction of a second anymore. In the morning, I walked past the mirror with a mug in my hand. I caught a glimpse of my reflection, and my reflection didn't move. It held still for a full second after I had already passed. Then it hurried to mimic the motion, as if trying to catch up. I stopped in my tracks and stared at the mirror, my hands shaking. My reflection stood there, staring back at me. When I lifted my left hand, the reflection waited almost a full second before lifting its left hand. It didn't feel like I was looking at a normal reflection anymore. It felt like something else was mimicking me in real time, but with a lag. I realized I didn't want to keep it in my living room. I decided to move it to a spare closet. I grabbed the mirror by its sides, careful not to touch the reflective surface, and leaned it against the wall. My heart was racing the whole time. My reflection seemed to stare at me from behind the glass. moving a half second too late. At one point it felt like my reflection's eyes lingered on me, even when I glanced away. My face felt hot, and my arms were shaking. But I managed to shove the mirror into the closet and close the door. I tried to go about my business for the rest of the day, making phone calls, responding to emails, sorting out some notes from my last trip. But I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror in my closet. I kept replaying that moment when I saw my reflection not moving at the same time as me. By late afternoon, I decided I wanted it out of my home entirely. I didn't know if I should give it to a museum or store it somewhere else, but I wanted it gone. Before making that decision, I told myself I needed to examine it one more time. Maybe I was missing something obvious. Maybe there was a reason for the delay that I hadn't figured out yet. So I went to the closet and opened the door. The mirror's surface was dim in the shadows, but I could still see my shape standing in front of it. I reached over to flick on a nearby light. My reflection was already standing upright, its eyes level with mine. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to stand still. My reflection stood motionless, but about a second later it straightened its posture, as if copying me a moment too late. My heart pounded so loudly that my vision felt shaky. I raised my right hand, and it waited a beat before raising its hand. Then I took a step backward, and my reflection stared at me for 2 seconds before finally taking a step back. This was more than just a lag. It looked like it was studying me before deciding to move. I whispered to myself, "What the hell is happening?" My voice quivered. I moved closer to the mirror, almost pressing my nose to the surface. My reflection was slow to respond, but eventually leaned in. At this point, I could see the tension in my own face, the beads of sweat near my hairline. But my reflection's expression was slightly off, like it was frowning more than I was. I took a step away, and its eyes flickered with something like curiosity. It didn't move for 3 seconds, then stepped away. I felt dizzy. My lungs felt tight. I wanted to put the mirror in my car and drive it out somewhere remote. I grabbed my coat and found a thick blanket, planning to wrap the mirror and toss it in my trunk. But as I reached for it, my reflection darted a hand out in the mirror's surface. It was quick, almost like it was trying to grab me through the glass. My heart jumped, and I stumbled backward, banging into the closet door. I let out a startled yell. My reflection still had its arm extended, but it was angled in a way that didn't match my own posture. I could see my arm at my side, but the reflection's arm was raised, palm facing me. It stayed like that for a few seconds, then slowly lowered its hand as though it was sneering at me. My mouth felt dry, and a cold sweat ran down my back. In a panic, I slammed the closet door shut. I heard the wood rattle. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the blanket. I cursed under my breath. I needed to calm down. I needed to think. I sank onto the couch in the living room. My pulse was racing and my forehead felt slick. I tried to focus on the facts. The mirror had some odd effect on my reflection, and it didn't show up on video. Whatever was going on, it was messing with my head. I felt a strong urge to leave the apartment, but I couldn't just abandon my own place because of some bizarre object. I decided to try locking the closet door, so I grabbed a spare lock from a drawer and fitted it onto the closet's latch. The lock clicked into place, and for a moment I felt a small hint of relief. But that relief faded quickly when I realized how unsettled I still felt. I spent the night in my bedroom with the door shut. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured my reflection stepping out of the mirror, creeping through the apartment. My rational mind told me that was impossible, but my body remained tense and my heart kept hammering. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and pressed my ear against my bedroom door, listening for any sounds. The apartment was quiet, but I still felt on edge. I tried to distract myself by reading some old field notes, but I couldn't concentrate on the words. My gaze kept drifting to the faint light coming in from under the bedroom door. I imagined a shadow passing by. My stomach churned and I forced myself to breathe slowly. When the sun finally rose, I decided I couldn't keep the mirror here any longer. I drank some coffee even though my hands were trembling. Then I walked to the closet with my phone in hand. The lock was still in place. I stood there breathing in and out, telling myself it was going to be fine. I grabbed the key, unclasped the lock, and opened the door. The mirror leaned against the wall, motionless. My reflection looked like me again, but it appeared tense. My reflection's eyes seemed slightly wider than usual. I realized I was also wide-eyed, but there was still that slight delay. I reached for the blanket on the floor. My reflection hesitated, then copied me. I carefully draped the blanket over the mirror, blocking most of its surface. I felt a jolt of relief, as if covering it would keep it from seeing me. I carried it outside, making sure to hold it firmly. The morning air was crisp, and I felt a slight breeze on my face. At my car, I popped the trunk and slid the mirror inside. I slammed the trunk shut faster than I should have, rattling its frame. My pulse wouldn't settle down. I climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I just drove. I needed to find somewhere remote, maybe close to where I'd found it. At least then I could leave it there and distance myself from it. As I drove, I checked my rearview mirror a few times. I half expected to see something staring back at me from the trunk, but all I saw was the empty back seat. My face was pale, and my eyes looked bloodshot. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I kept replaying the moment that the reflection's hand shot out. I couldn't erase that image from my mind. I pulled into an old rest area, a deserted spot near some hiking trails. I parked away from any other cars. There was only one vehicle in the lot, and I didn't see anyone around. I popped the trunk and stood there staring at the covered mirror. My stomach was in knots. I paced around for a minute, trying to work up the courage to grab it again. Finally, I yanked it out and carried it towards a thick cluster of trees. The blanket slipped a bit, revealing part of the reflective surface. I glimpsed my reflection's face. It looked furious or maybe desperate. I could see my own shaky expression, but with a noticeable delay. I felt a wave of nausea. I adjusted the blanket to cover it fully and continued walking. After a few minutes, I found a spot behind some large boulders. I placed the mirror against a rock, my arms stiff from carrying it. I felt the urge to smash it, but I didn't want shards of broken glass around me. I also had no idea if destroying it would solve anything or just make it worse. I left it there, covered. I stared at it for a few moments, my heart hammering in my ears. Then I turned around and walked away, not looking back. I got into my car, hands trembling. My breath felt shallow, and sweat clung to the back of my neck. I started the car and left that rest area, forcing myself not to glance in the rearview mirror more than I had to. I didn't feel safe exactly, but I felt like I might be able to sleep again. I gripped the wheel and focused on the road. My mind kept going back to that last look at my reflection, the way it seemed to have its own expression. The memory made my chest tighten, but I told myself it was over. I drove home, locked my door, and collapsed on the couch. I didn't look in any mirrors for the rest of that day. Even now, I avoid them when possible. I'm not sure if that mirror is still out there, wrapped in a blanket and sitting against a boulder. I haven't heard anything about it, and I haven't told anyone the whole story. I just know I'm not going to look for it again. I try to live my life in my small apartment with my old research books and the knowledge I've gathered over the years, but I keep all my mirrors covered now. I don't trust reflections anymore. And sometimes when I pass by a reflective window or a polished metal surface, I swear I catch a delayed movement out of the corner of my eye. Then I force myself to look away. I figure it's better not to see what might be there waiting to do something I'm not doing. I never expected an empty canvas to make me sweat. When I first saw it leaning against the workshop wall, I wondered if there had been a mistake. My client told me it was old, but there was nothing on it. It looked like a blank piece of rough-aged linen, stretched on a wooden frame that had seen better days. I moved closer, inspecting the surface. I felt a slight shiver when my fingers brushed the texture. It wasn't smooth or uniform. There were faint lines under the topmost coat of white, like something buried. At first I thought it was just uneven primer. I set it down on my table and decided to run a few quick tests. I turned on my desk lamp and tilted the canvas. Under the glare, I noticed small cracks in the paint. The cracks formed irregular patterns like hidden brush strokes. My heart gave a single heavy thump, as there was something there. I wanted to see if there were older layers, so I used a magnifier. Up close I saw flecks of color, dark green in one spot, dull red in another. I felt a spike of curiosity. If there was a painting under all that white, I would find it. I live for the moment when an old image emerges from layers of time. That's the thrill of my job. I took a deep breath and started setting up my station. My workshop was small but organized. I had chemicals, cotton swabs, and a special heater to control the temperature around the painting. I also had a cooler corner of the room near the window. I often work with controlled temperatures to see if certain types of paint react differently to heat or cold. I began by taking a corner of the canvas and applying a mild solvent just to see if the top layer would come off without damage. The white layer started to dissolve in tiny patches. I wiped gently, waiting for a clearer view of whatever was underneath. I leaned in, squinting. I saw the outline of a structure, maybe a building or a small cottage. It was faint, just a patch of dark shape against a lighter background. I felt a flicker of excitement. I turned off the solvent and let the canvas dry. Then I noticed something strange. The color under the white looked different depending on the angle of my lamp. I pulled my stool closer and inspected it again. It was late, and the room was a bit chilly. I realized I hadn't closed the window properly. The temperature had dropped significantly, but as the temperature dropped, the dark shape on the canvas seemed to sharpen. I rubbed my arms and clicked on a space heater nearby. Within a few minutes, the shape softened again, almost disappearing under a thin veil of white. It was as if the cooler air had triggered some chemical reaction in the paint. I tested that theory by turning off the space heater and opening the window a bit more. The room got colder, and the shape grew clearer. I saw slanted walls, a peaked roof, and a door. The painting looked like a modest house in a clearing surrounded by tall, leafless trees. The details were faint, like a scene viewed through a thin fog. A chill ran down my back. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mix of fascination and unease. I decided to call it a night, cover the canvas, and lock up. But before I left, I gave it one last glance. The house looked slightly more defined. I saw a window, and maybe a fence. I rubbed my eyes and left, ignoring the tingle in my gut. The next day I woke up early and hurried back to the workshop. I felt a weird pull toward that canvas, like I had to see if I'd imagined the changes. The morning sun was bright, and the workshop was at a comfortable temperature. I removed the cover from the canvas and almost laughed. The painting seemed empty again, just a faint shape if I tilted my head. I decided to play with the temperature more systematically. I set the thermostat to a lower setting and waited. Slowly, the air in the workshop became cooler, and my breath felt a little heavier in my chest. I saw the painting get clearer. The same small house, the same leafless trees. There was a path leading away from the front door, curving around the right side of the canvas. It was like watching a photograph develop in a dark room. I felt pins and needles on my arms. I placed a digital thermometer on my table. It read 60 degrees Fahrenheit. As it dropped to 58, I noticed new details. The fence around the house seemed broken in parts. There were what looked like footprints or indentations in the ground, but I couldn't see them clearly. I decided to drop the temperature further, so I pulled out a portable air conditioner I sometimes use for certain projects. As the air got colder, my fingers felt stiff. I put on a light jacket and kept watching the painting. The scene became more distinct. I saw something on the ground near the fence. It looked like a large box or crate. The roof of the house had missing shingles, and the wood seemed warped in spots. My heart was beating faster. I leaned in to examine the brushstrokes. I realized there were multiple layers here, each triggered by a certain temperature. If the temperature was around 60 degrees, I saw the first scene, the small rundown house with a broken fence. Around 55 degrees it shifted. The ground became muddier. The trees looked like they had been stripped of their bark. The path had a strange texture, as though it was wet and uneven. I stepped back and rubbed my hands. My breath came out in small clouds now. The thermometer read 52 degrees. That's when I noticed more changes. The house no longer looked empty. A light glowed through one of the windows on the second floor. I couldn't see movement, but that glow made my scalp tingle. I kept the air conditioner running until the temperature in the workshop reached 48 degrees. My teeth chattered a bit and my nose felt cold. The painting took on a darker tone. The trees seemed closer to the house, as if they had grown or bent inward. The fence looked rotten, leaning at odd angles. The box near the fence was open, and I thought I saw something inside it, but the details were blurry. I stared at that spot until my vision blurred. There was a tension in my shoulders, as if I were bracing for something. Then I heard a popping sound from the circuit breaker. The air conditioner clicked off. The power had tripped. I cursed under my breath and flipped the switch back on. But I decided I needed a break. My hands were freezing and I felt jumpy. I shut everything down and went to get some coffee. I came back an hour later, letting the workshop return to a more normal temperature. The painting went back to showing almost nothing. The white layer seemed to reassert itself and the house faded away. The thermostat read around 68 degrees now. I stood there finishing my coffee, wondering if I had discovered some kind of temperature-sensitive paint. I had heard of old pigments that changed color with heat or cold, but I'd never seen anything this elaborate. I felt a growing urge to push further, to see what other layers existed. I checked my supplies to make sure I had enough protective gear and decided to tackle it after dinner. I was too wired to do anything else. That evening, I set up a new system to control the temperature more precisely. I closed all windows, sealed the doors, and turned on the air conditioner. I watched the thermometer drop slowly. At 60 degrees, the basic scene appeared again. At 55, I saw the muddy ground. At 52, I noticed the second floor window glowing. At 50, the fence posts looked twisted, and the crate next to them appeared more like a chest with broken hinges. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I pulled my jacket closer around me. The air felt heavy, almost damp. My breath tasted stale, and I had a faint ache behind my eyes. I kept lowering the temperature. At 47 degrees, the scene became sharper. The bark on the trees seemed peeled away, leaving pale, raw trunks. The door of the house was partly open, revealing darkness inside. My stomach cramped. I couldn't explain why, but I felt something in my chest tighten. Like my body sensed I was crossing a line. I forced myself to continue. I wanted to see the entire painting. I wanted to know how many layers existed. At 45 degrees, the glow in the second floor window changed color. It went from a soft yellow to a harsher, almost bluish light that pulsed slightly, like a flickering bulb. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I touched my face and found it clammy. I blinked to clear my vision. The painting looked more detailed, but also more disturbing. The ground around the house had dark patches, like large wet stains. The fence had collapsed in places. The chest by the fence was wide open, and I saw a tangle of shapes inside that looked twisted and jumbled, maybe blankets or old cloths. My jaw clenched. I felt a rush of adrenaline, like I was about to run from something. I decided to push just a bit more. I lowered the thermostat to 43 degrees. That's when the air conditioner made a grinding noise, like it was struggling. The lights in the workshop flickered. My eyes were locked on the painting. The scene had changed again. The chest was now lying on its side, and something spilled out of it. The house door looked wider open. The glow in the upstairs window flickered, lighting the inside of the room. I thought I saw a shape near that window, a silhouette or an outline. I couldn't see a face, just a darker area behind the glass. A knot formed in my throat. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. I felt dizzy but couldn't look away. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees. I was shivering. My fingertips were numb. My breath came out in shaking spurts. I stepped closer, bracing my free hand on the edge of the table to steady myself. The painting's details were so crisp now. The path leading around the house looked wet, almost shiny. The trees angled in like jagged pillars. The fence was broken in multiple places. The chest spilled a cluster of ragged objects. I couldn't tell if they were clothes or rags. I tried to focus on the upstairs window. The light was strobing, flickering on and off. The silhouette was gone, but I felt like someone was staring back at me. My heart hammered in my ears. I was breathing through my mouth, taking quick, shallow breaths. Suddenly, the entire workshop went dark. The air conditioner stopped. The lights went out. I stumbled and almost fell. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the breaker box. I heard a soft humming from the air conditioner, as if it were about to restart. But then it clicked off again. The overhead lights blinked once, then stayed dead. My phone's flashlight cast shaky shadows on the walls. I felt frantic. My chest was tight and I had trouble breathing. I hurried to the breaker box, flipping switches. Eventually, the lights returned with a loud buzz. But the air conditioner was shot. The temperature started rising again. I forced myself to turn around and face the painting. My phone's flashlight shone on it. The scene was still there, but it was starting to fade. The bark on the trees regained some color. The twisted fence posts smoothed out and the door of the house looked less open. The chest on the ground blurred a bit, its contents losing definition. My pulse was still racing. My throat felt dry. I wasn't sure if I wanted the painting to fade or if I wanted to keep seeing it. I stepped forward, shining the light to check if there were any hidden markings. I saw small letters along the bottom edge, half covered by flaking paint. I crouched down. The letters looked like a name or maybe a date, but they were distorted by the cracks. My eyes burned. I gave up, feeling exhausted. It was around midnight and I was freezing. I powered down the workshop, placed the painting on a vertical stand against the wall and locked up. On the walk home, I noticed my hands were shaking. My gut was tight and I felt anxious. I couldn't shake the image of that flickering light in the window. I kept imagining it strobing faster, like something inside was trying to send a signal. I clutched my jacket, took deep breaths, and forced myself not to run. The night air felt harsh on my skin. When I got inside my apartment, I turned on every light. I couldn't sleep well. My mind kept looping through those images. I kept seeing the twisted trees, the dark interior of that house, the half-spilled chest. I imagined the silhouette leaning closer to the window. My mouth went dry, just thinking about it. The next morning I felt sore from tension. My shoulders were stiff, and I had a headache. I drove to the workshop with a feeling of dread. The canvas was exactly where I left it. In the normal warmth of the day, it looked harmless. I ran my fingers over the surface. I felt faint scratches and ridges. I wanted to see if the painting had any other secrets, but my air conditioner was broken, and it was summer. I couldn't recreate those conditions easily. I sat on my stool gazing at the faint lines. I thought about calling the client, explaining the situation, but I didn't know how to describe it. Your blank canvas has hidden layers that only appear in the cold. They show a disturbing house that gets worse as it gets colder. That sounded ridiculous. Still, I felt I owed him an update. I decided to gather my notes and photos first. I checked my phone for the pictures I took. The images were blurry, as if the painting didn't photograph well. The details I remembered weren't clear. It was like the camera lens couldn't capture those strange layers. I shivered, remembering how real they looked in person. I set my phone aside and placed my palm against my forehead. My skin felt hot. Part of me wanted to destroy the painting. Another part of me felt drawn to it. I wanted to understand how it worked, where it came from, who made it. But I also wanted to get rid of it. I was worried about what else might appear if I found a way to make the workshop even colder. I sat there, my heart drumming. I stared at the cracks in the paint, waiting for them to move or shift. They didn't, but I couldn't relax. I felt short of breath. My entire body was tense. I listened to the hum of the workshop lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. I thought about the flickering window and the shape I might have seen. My skin tingled. I had the sense that if I triggered an even lower temperature, I would see something far worse. I felt my pulse thudding in my temples. I decided not to try it again. I'd seen enough. I checked my watch, then gathered my tools and locked up. I planned to call my client that afternoon. I left with my shoulders tight and my stomach in knots. I turned back once before leaving, staring at the canvas from across the workshop. Even from that distance, it looked like an ordinary blank painting. But I knew what was under that top layer. I shut the lights and left the room. On my way out, I felt the weight of the key in my pocket. My heart was still beating fast. I gripped the doorknob for a moment, then pulled the door shut behind me. I walked outside into the warm air, feeling a jolt of relief as the sun hit my face. I wanted to forget what I'd seen, but I knew it wouldn't leave my mind so easily. My hands felt damp and my breathing was shaky. The memory of that flickering light stayed with me, pressing against my chest. I promised myself I wouldn't go back there alone at night. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the painting or what might appear if I pushed it further. Either way, I was done testing it. I just hoped I could keep it that way. I got this telescope a few weeks ago. It seemed like a fun way to spend my nights checking out the rings of Saturn or scanning the moon's surface. It was a brand new model with a fancy computerized mount. When I unboxed it, I felt like a kid who just gotten his favorite gift. I set it up in my backyard, aligned it according to the instructions, and waited for nightfall. That first night seemed normal enough, but then something strange happened. By the second night, I started seeing patterns in the sky that made no sense. I'd always used star charts and online apps to identify constellations. I enjoy that sense of orientation when I match the map with the real sky. But on that second night, I couldn't find any familiar star groups. The sky looked off. I saw bright points in places that didn't correspond to anything in my charts. I double-checked the telescope's alignment, recalibrated it, and tried different filters. Nothing changed the fact that the star patterns looked weird, like random clusters. I felt confused but tried to keep calm. Maybe I messed up the settings. Maybe the mount was defective. On the third night, the telescope showed an arrangement of stars that looked like shapes. They weren't constellations I'd ever seen, but they resembled symbols, like characters from a language I didn't recognize. They were sharp too. Through the eyepiece, I could see little outlines of what looked like lines and curves formed by the stars. I stepped back and stared at my telescope in disbelief. Chill moved across my shoulders. I took a breath and looked again. Shapes were still there. This was not my imagination. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. My mouth felt dry, and I swallowed a few times, trying to stay rational. I wanted to take pictures. I had my phone adapter and a decent camera. I tried snapping photos through the eyepiece, but every single time the resulting image showed a normal sky. It was the usual arrangement of constellations, nothing special. At first I assumed I was messing up the focus or angle. I tinkered with the camera settings. I tried different exposures, but the results were always the same. The photos showed the night sky as anyone would expect it to look. No mysterious symbols, no strange patterns. I felt frustration building in my chest. I wiped my forehead, which was getting damp from standing outside in the humid night air. When I checked the sky with my naked eye, everything looked normal. The weird shapes only appeared through the telescope. I started feeling uneasy. Part of me wondered if I was losing it.
I hadn't told anyone about this yet.
I didn't want to come across like some conspiracy theorist who sees UFOs every time they look up. But my curiosity pushed me to keep investigating. The nights that followed only intensified the experience. Each time I looked through the eyepiece, I saw new sets of shapes. They almost looked like runes or glyphs. The patterns kept shifting from one night to the next. Sometimes I would stare at them for half an hour, trying to decode them or at least find some repeating pattern. But I couldn't make sense of it. My head started to pound after long sessions, and I felt tension across my shoulders and neck. I decided to check the manufacturer's website to see if anyone else had reported something like this. I spent hours reading user forums. Nothing. Nobody mentioned seeing strange star patterns that didn't match star charts. I checked astronomy blogs, online communities, everything I could think of. I found no similar cases. That made me feel more isolated. I started to question my own sanity again. Then I noticed something else that made the situation worse. During the day, I spotted faint marks on objects around me. They looked like the symbols I'd seen at night. The first time I noticed one was on the side of my car. It was a small, almost invisible scratch, but when I looked closely, it seemed to have a pattern that matched one of the star formations I'd seen the week before. I felt a jolt in my chest and my hands got clammy. I ran my fingers over the scratch. It felt shallow and random, but visually it was way too similar to be a coincidence. Over the next few days, I spotted more of these markings. One was on the front door of my house, another was on a metal lamppost near the sidewalk, another was on a cardboard box in my garage. Each mark looked slightly different, but the style matched. It had those same curved lines and angular shapes. My stomach twisted whenever I found a new one. I started scanning my surroundings constantly, looking for more. I was jumpy. My nights were restless because I kept dreaming of those symbols swirling around my head. I tried to remain calm and logical, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe these marks had always been there, and I was just noticing them now. But that didn't feel right. I'm pretty observant, especially with anything that resembles a pattern or sign. I couldn't ignore the connection. It was too direct. At that point, I decided to take a break from using the telescope. I thought if I stayed away from it for a while, I might clear my head. I spent a whole weekend without looking at the sky. I tried to distract myself with movies, chores, and normal errands. But I still felt that pull. Every time I walked by my telescope, I got this urge to check if something new had appeared. By Sunday night, I gave in and went out to the backyard again. That night, the sky through the scope looked even stranger. I saw what could have been a cluster of stars shaped like a spiral. But instead of a natural curve, it had sharp edges. It looked like a broken spiral with jagged corners, almost like a stylized swirl you see carved into stone. I got a lump in my throat. My palms grew sweaty and I caught myself breathing faster. I could almost feel a buzzing sensation in the back of my skull. I tried to take a photo. Once again, the photo just showed Orion, Taurus, and the usual stars. Nothing unusual. I kept glancing around the backyard like I expected someone to be watching me. The night felt heavy. The trees rustled in a slight breeze. I heard a dog bark a few houses away. My focus kept shifting between the telescope and the darkness. My mind raced with questions. Was I hallucinating? Was there something about this particular telescope that created illusions? It didn't make any sense. Telescopes don't produce random illusions, especially not ones that look like consistent symbols. That's when I remembered the day markings again. I hurried inside and checked all the spots where I'd seen them before. They were still there, just as faint as before. I took photos of those scratches and scuffs. At least those showed up in the images. When I zoomed in on them on my phone, they looked bizarrely clean in their outlines. They weren't normal wear and tear. They looked deliberate. Over the next week, I found even more of these marks. Some were on street signs near my house. Some were on random walls in nearby alleys. I even saw one on the bottom of a coffee mug in my kitchen cabinet. That discovery made me jump back, nearly dropping the mug. These things were everywhere, and I had no explanation. I felt my throat tighten and my heart pound. This was no longer just about the telescope. Something else was happening, and I was caught in the middle of it. I started feeling paranoid. I checked the locks on my doors and windows. I felt anxious whenever I left the house. My mind kept playing tricks on me. I'd see a shape in the corner of my vision and spin around, thinking it was another mark or something more sinister. At night, I toss and turn in bed, my heart racing whenever I thought about stepping outside to look at the sky. But I couldn't stop. I felt drawn to the telescope, even though it terrified me. One night, I decided to try a different approach. I set up my phone to record a video feed through the eyepiece. I let it run for a while, focusing on the spot where I saw the strangest configuration. After about 10 minutes, I stopped the recording and played it back. The video just showed a normal star field. I wanted to scream in frustration. I felt a hot flush on my cheeks. My muscles tensed. I cursed under my breath. None of this made any sense, and I had no way to prove what I was seeing. As time went on, the symbols in the sky seemed to intensify. They would pulse in and out of focus, as if they were flickering. I'd hear a ringing in my ears whenever I looked at them for too long. My head would start pounding and I'd have to pull away from the scope. My vision would feel blurry for a minute or two afterward. My mouth would go dry, and I'd have to sit down, breathe slowly, and wait for the feeling to pass. I contacted a friend who's into astronomy. I asked him to come over and check out my new telescope without giving him too many details. I just said I was getting weird images. When he arrived, we waited until it was dark. I positioned the scope at the section of sky where I usually saw the symbols. I tried to stay calm and casual, like this was just a simple test. He looked through the eyepiece for a long time. Then he said he saw nothing unusual, just the standard stars. My heart dropped. I insisted he look again, adjusting the focus exactly how I do it. He saw nothing. He gave me a concerned look, like maybe I needed help. That look made my stomach tighten. I forced a smile and shrugged it off, telling him maybe I just had a glitch in the mount alignment. But inside, I was freaking out. He left, and I felt more alone than ever. If nobody else could see these patterns, then they might be only in my head, but they felt real. The marks around my house were real, so there had to be a connection. My gut told me something was happening that nobody else could sense. The next day, I found another mark on my living room wall. It was near the corner behind a lamp. I only noticed it because I was cleaning. It looked fresh, like it had been carved. The surface paint was chipped away in a thin line. I knelt down and traced it with my finger. It was an intricate symbol, almost exactly like the swirl I'd seen in the sky a few nights before. I felt a surge of panic. My heart hammered. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled my hand away and backed out of the room. I stood in the hallway, breathing fast, trying to calm myself. That was the moment I realized there might not be a simple fix. The telescope was only part of this. The day markings were just as important. I decided to see if they lined up with the nightly patterns. I started making rough sketches of the symbols I'd seen through the telescope. I wrote them down in a notebook, copying them from memory as best I could. Then I went around my house and neighborhood, photographing every strange mark I could find. After a few days, I had a collection of images on my phone and a set of sketches in my notebook. When I compared them, I saw clear matches. Some of the symbols from the sky were identical to the ones in my garage or on the sidewalk. Others were slight variations, but they still had similar shapes. My gut twisted. This wasn't random. Whatever was going on, it had a pattern. I started spending my evenings obsessively tracking each new formation in the sky. Each morning, I'd walk around looking for corresponding symbols. I was sleep-deprived, my eyes bloodshot, and my moods were erratic. I'd snap at people for no reason, then apologize. I tried not to mention the symbols to anyone else. I didn't want to be labeled crazy, but inside I was spiraling. Every noise at night made me jump. My neck felt stiff from constantly turning around, checking my surroundings. One night I stayed up until dawn, watching the sky for hours. Near the end of my vigil, just before the sun came up, a final pattern appeared. It was a bold geometric shape made of dozens of tiny points of light. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest. I could see lines linking these points, forming a strange grid. A ringing started in my ears. My vision blurred. I gripped the telescope so hard my hands hurt. I was afraid to blink, afraid to lose this image. Then the sun rose and it faded. My scope just showed a pale blue sky. Later that morning, I dragged myself around the yard, half expecting to see that geometric shape carved into the side of my house. But it wasn't there. I checked the fence, the mailbox, the trash bins. Nothing. For a moment I felt relief. Then I stepped inside and froze. Right on the living room floor, etched into the wooden boards, was the same grid. The lines were faint, but I could see them if I looked carefully. They crisscrossed the floor in the exact pattern I'd seen in the sky. I sank down to my knees, feeling a wave of dizziness. My breath came in shallow gasps. My hands shook. I reached out and touched the grooves in the wood. They were real.
I still don't have answers.
The symbols keep appearing both in the sky and around me. I can capture them on camera at night, and nobody else seems to see them through my telescope. I feel trapped in this bizarre cycle. My body is tense all the time. I feel a pit in my stomach whenever nightfall approaches, but I can't stop myself from going outside and looking again. The more I see, the more I find new marks in my home and around town. I've learned to live with that constant unease, but it's wearing me down. I'm not sure where this is leading. Maybe I'm on the verge of discovering something, or maybe I'm just stuck in a loop that won't end. For now, I keep my telescope pointed at the sky, waiting for the next pattern to show up. I keep bracing myself every time I scan my surroundings during the day. Part of me wants to destroy the telescope and try to forget all of this. But I can't bring myself to do it. Something about these shapes has a hold on me. I don't know what they mean, and I don't know why they're appearing. All I know is that each night brings a new configuration, and each day I find more signs that it's bleeding into my world. That's the situation I'm in, and I'm just trying to hold on to my sanity while it unfolds around me. I never expected an abandoned place to look so alive. The moment I stepped through the rusty gates of that mansion, I felt a heavy jolt in my chest. The front yard looked neglected and tangled, but there was something off about it. The real estate agent barely gave me any details, only telling me that the owner would pay well for my landscaping work. I didn't care about rumors. I wanted the job. The property was huge, and I had never seen so many ornate statues scattered around a yard before. They were carved from some dull stone, each figure frozen in a different pose. Some held vases, others brandished shields, and a few had their arms raised toward the sky. Even though it was midday, the place felt dim. I noticed thick vines wrapped around the statue's legs. I checked my watch, turned on my phone's flashlight, and walked deeper into the yard. My first day of work was mostly about clearing debris and assessing how much time I'd need to restore the gardens. I saw broken fountains and cracked pathways, and stagnant water had pooled in certain areas, leaving a sour smell in the air. I heard a few birds but didn't see any. Instead, I caught the sound of my own boots scraping against the gravel. Every step felt too loud in that silent expanse. I knew I had my work cut out for me, so I sat down my toolkit and started cleaning. By late afternoon, I noticed something strange. When I first arrived, one statue was holding a shield at waist level, pointing it toward the house. After I took a break to get a drink, I saw that the shield had shifted slightly. It was almost pointing toward the large hedge on the eastern side of the property. I assumed I was just tired or had misremembered the statue's position. I shook my head and kept working, but I made a mental note to check again the next day. On my second day, I started trimming the overgrown hedges. I hauled out dead branches and cut through thick brush that had been left untouched for years. My hands got scratched, and I used a pair of heavy-duty gloves to avoid more cuts. I laid fresh mulch in a few spots. The agent had supplied me with enough tools and materials, so I didn't worry about running out of anything. After a few hours, I stood back to see my progress, and that's when I noticed another statue had changed position. This time, a figure that had its arm raised to the sky was now leaning forward with its hand angled toward that same eastern hedge. My heart pounded. I rubbed my eyes. It wasn't my imagination. Something was making these statues move. I spent the rest of that afternoon checking every statue one by one. I started with the ones near the main entrance and circled them, looking for joints or mechanical parts. I found nothing. The stone looked solid and rough, covered in a layer of dust. I didn't see footprints around them either, except my own. I couldn't figure out how they were changing positions. I felt a slight chill on the back of my neck. I stayed quiet and listened to the wind rustling the unkempt grass. No one else was there. That evening I locked up my tools and walked around with a flashlight. The sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the yard. A faint orange glow made the statues appear more menacing. I approached the largest one, a tall figure with a broken spear, located near the hedge on the east side. The spear tip was pointed away from the hedge when I first arrived in the morning. By sunset, it was angled directly at the thickest part of the greenery. I stepped closer to the hedge and pushed aside some branches. Behind the leaves, I saw an old metal gate hidden. It was low to the ground, about waist height, with a small latch on one side. I tried to pull it open, but it was locked. I left it alone and decided to return in the morning with better lighting. On the third day, I felt uneasy. I kept expecting to see someone else lurking behind the bushes, maybe moving the statues just to mess with me. But the place remained silent, and the caretaker who let me in each morning had his own tasks in the main house. I rarely saw him. Around midday, I worked up the courage to check that hidden metal gate again. I cut away the vines and pulled at the latch. It was rusted shut. I used a small crowbar to pry it open. The hinges creaked, and the gate gave way. Behind it, there was a narrow stone staircase leading underground. The steps were steep and dusty, disappearing into darkness. My pulse quickened, and I felt sweat building on my forehead. I switched on my flashlight and shone it down the steps. I didn't see much. I could make out stone walls on each side, slightly damp. The smell of musty air drifted up. I stood there for a moment, wondering if this was part of the property that no one told me about. The contract never mentioned an underground area. I thought about turning away, but the memory of those shifting statues drove me forward. I took a deep breath and started down. My boots scraped against the rough steps as I made my way down. I had to duck my head in a few spots where the ceiling was too low. Water dripped from above, leaving small puddles on the steps. My flashlight flickered against the walls, revealing patches of moss and tiny creeping insects. The air felt thick, and my breathing grew heavier as I reached a flat landing. The corridor continued, but it seemed to open up into a larger space ahead. I stepped into a wide chamber. The first thing I noticed was a faint greenish glow. I looked around and saw strange plants growing from the ceiling. They looked like ferns or vines, but they were hanging upside down, with roots exposed near the top. The leaves and stems stretched downward, and they glimmered in a soft, phosphorescent glow. My skin tingled, and I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was standing in a large underground garden. I moved my flashlight beam across the area. There were rows of these plants aligned in neat lines. Each row had some type of vine or flower growing upside down. I stepped closer, and my boots sank into damp soil. There were no footprints except mine. The glow from the plants lit the chamber just enough to see without my flashlight, so I turned it off to preserve the battery. The green light gave everything a weird tint. I reached out and touched a hanging leaf. It felt slightly warm, which surprised me. The underside of the leaf was slick with moisture. My fingers came away with some kind of luminescent residue. I wiped it on my pants and it left a faint smear. A few minutes passed while I walked between the rows, searching for any sign of who might be maintaining this place. The soil looked freshly turned. I tapped it with the toe of my boot and realized it was firm but not dry. It reminded me of a greenhouse environment, but there were no heat lamps or irrigation lines. Suddenly I heard a clicking sound behind me. My heart jumped. I spun around and aimed my flashlight at the corridor. I didn't see anyone. I realized the sound might be the gate or the hinge on the door at the top of the staircase. The possibility of being locked in crossed my mind. I felt my throat tighten, and my breathing went shallow. I hurried back to the staircase. The door was still open. I exhaled and leaned against the wall, trying to calm down. My nerves were on edge. I decided to leave that underground garden alone for the rest of the day. Before heading back up, I picked a small glowing leaf and slid it into a plastic bag I found in my jacket pocket. I wanted to check it later under normal light. Maybe I'd ask the caretaker if he knew anything about that underground room. Once I climbed out and closed the gate behind me, I felt a little better. The afternoon sunlight hit my face, and I took a few deep breaths. I wiped sweat from my forehead, locked the gate, and stuffed the key in my pocket. Back in the main yard, the statues hadn't moved since morning, which felt even more unnerving. I walked around, trimmed a few bushes, and tried to focus on my actual job, but I kept looking over my shoulder at the statues. Each one seemed to be facing in the direction of the hidden gate. My stomach twisted every time I noticed how their arms or heads pointed that way. I got this strong urge to leave the property, but I knew I couldn't quit. The pay was too good, and I also felt drawn to whatever was going on here. That night, I sat in my truck and looked at the leaf I had bagged. It still glowed faintly, even though it had been out of the ground for a few hours. The glow was dimmer, but it was there. I placed it on the passenger seat, turned off the cabin light, and watched it pulsing with a gentle green hue. It gave me chills. I slid it back into the plastic bag, sealed it, and decided not to think too much about it. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my landscaping tasks, but the statues continued to move. Some had their heads tilted, others changed the position of their arms. All of them seemed to point in the same direction, toward that small gate. I asked the caretaker if he knew anything about a hidden staircase or underground garden. He shrugged and told me he had never been beyond the locked gate. He said the mansion's original owners kept a lot of secrets, but he didn't want to talk about them. I didn't push him. As I started noticing changes in the underground garden, I saw new growth on the upside-down plants. Their leaves spread wider, and the glow got stronger. The temperature felt colder each time, and the walls had more condensation. I checked the soil and found no signs of standard nutrients. I couldn't explain how these things were thriving. I tried collecting samples, but they would dim and shrivel after a few hours in my truck. It felt like they needed that underground space to survive. One afternoon, I heard a scraping noise while I was down there. It sounded like stone against stone. My pulse raced as I walked toward the staircase, aiming my flashlight at the walls. I half expected one of those statues to appear at the bottom of the steps, but I didn't see anything. The scraping sound stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening to my own breathing, hearing little water droplets echo through the chamber. My palms were sweaty, and I gripped the flashlight so tight that my knuckles turned white. As I started to realize that the statues might be moving on their own, or something was guiding them. Every day they angled themselves at that hidden garden. I felt as if they wanted me to keep going down there. I couldn't figure out why. I checked each statue for any sign of tampering and found none. At one point I tried setting up a small camera overnight, but the battery died and the footage was useless. I kept my distance from the statues after that. I did my basic landscaping tasks, trimmed hedges, cleared weeds, and adjusted the old irrigation system near the main fountain. The caretaker asked if I was making progress. I told him yes, but I didn't mention the underground garden anymore. A few times I caught him staring at the statues with a concerned look, but he never asked questions. During my final week of work, I decided to return to the underground garden one last time. My curiosity was eating at me. I went down the steps, flashlight in hand, and noticed that the green glow was stronger than before. The plants looked thicker, hanging all around me. They almost formed a canopy overhead. I found what looked like a cluster of large buds near the far wall. Each bud had a faint pulse of light inside it. I reached out and touched one bud, feeling its surface tremble under my fingertips. Then I heard that scraping noise again, but this time it was louder. It sounded close, like it was coming from above. My heart hammered in my ears and my scalp tingled. I ran to the stairs, flashing the light around me. I climbed up as fast as I could, tripping on a loose step. My right knee banged against the stone and I cursed under my breath. I gritted my teeth, pushed myself up, and kept going. I made it through the gate, slammed it shut, and locked it. I stood there, panting, staring at the statues. All of them were facing me with their arms raised. I could see them in the fading sunlight. My shirt was drenched in sweat, and I felt my pulse hammering in my temples. I gathered my tools without bothering to finish my scheduled tasks. I wanted to get off that property. I wiped the dirt from my jeans, climbed into my truck, and drove out through the rusty gates. My breathing was still ragged, and I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Once I was on the main road, I pulled over and tried to calm myself. I told myself that the moving statues in the upside-down glowing plants had to have some explanation. Maybe there was a hidden mechanism, or maybe the place was rigged somehow. But every time I tried to reason it out, I remembered the sight of those statues shifting from day to day. I fulfilled my contract, but I didn't linger. I got my final payment, packed up my tools, and left. I didn't tell anyone about that underground garden except the caretaker, who only gave me a blank stare. He didn't admit anything, and he didn't deny anything either. To this day, I still wonder if those statues are pointing to that hidden passage, luring people down into that underground space. I can shake the memory of that soft green glow or the way the plants seemed to grow in the wrong direction. I didn't see them die, and I didn't see them spread, but I can forget the feeling of stepping into that chamber, surrounded by that cold air and the eerie light. I don't plan on going back, but I can't pretend it never happened. I still have the plastic bag with that shriveled leaf locked away in a spare toolbox. Sometimes I take it out and see a faint glow, even now, and I quickly seal it up again. I try not to think about what might still be growing under that mansion where the sun never shines. I got the call on a Wednesday afternoon. The voice on the other end told me there was a large Victorian mansion outside the city limits, and they needed someone with my experience. I'd done plenty of restorations before. I'd never worked on anything that old or that big. The mansion had over 30 rooms, and apparently it had been through several attempts at renovation without much success. The owner was vague about the problems. He just said things don't stick. I was curious, but I also needed the money, so I took the job. I packed up my truck that weekend and drove out to see the place. When I first arrived, I noticed the yard was overgrown. The gates creaked as I pushed them open. The main path to the front door was cracked and uneven. I saw weeds poking through the gaps in the walkway. The place looked abandoned. The windows were streaked with dirt and the paint on the wood siding was peeling off in chunks. The porch sagged in the middle. The front door handle felt loose when I tried to turn it. I managed to get it open on the third try using a bit of force. Inside, the air smelled stale, like nobody had breathed in there for a while. Dust floated in the sunlight. The wooden floors creaked under my boots. I remember thinking the structure felt like it was leaning to one side, though I couldn't say for sure. I checked a few rooms before meeting the caretaker, a thin man with short hair and a nervous look in his eyes. He told me that the owner was out of town and had authorized him to provide any assistance I needed. He was polite enough but wouldn't step more than a few feet into the house. He stood near the doorway and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I asked him why he seemed uneasy. He said the house had a reputation. Past crews had quit without finishing, and there were rumors of strange sounds at night. I didn't pay much attention to that. I'm not someone who believes in hauntings or curses. I've heard stories on other sites, usually just the wind and creaking rafters, or old pipes. I told him not to worry. I'd work alone if necessary. He nodded but didn't look convinced. I started the project the next day. I did a full walkthrough, taking measurements, marking walls that needed structural repair, and sketching a plan for each floor. I spent hours examining the architecture, noting all the details that made it a classic Victorian house. The tall ceilings, the ornate trim, and the stained glass windows. Some were intact, others cracked. I figured I'd replace the broken ones with replicas. I wanted to keep the original spirit of the house, but also ensure everything was sound and safe. After finishing my initial notes, I went to the small office near the foyer. There was a huge stack of old blueprints. Some dated back decades, possibly from the original construction. Others were more recent, from previous renovations that never got completed. I spread them out on the desk and tried to line them up with the new measurements I'd taken that morning. That's when I noticed some inconsistencies. Several older plans showed extra rooms, hallways that didn't appear in the current layout, or strange corridors that seemed to connect to nowhere. I didn't think much of it right then. Sometimes owners seal off rooms or remove them during major updates. I figured that might have happened at some point in the mansion's history. But as I flipped through more pages, I found sketches of a second dining room in a small library that I'd never seen. According to the notes, these had been removed after a fire in the early... Still, something felt off. The caretaker hadn't mentioned any major structural changes. That evening, I stayed until it got dark. I had my portable work light set up on the second floor where I'd started pulling down old wallpaper. I heard faint sounds in the hallway. It might have been pipes, but it sounded more like footsteps. I went to investigate, but didn't see anyone. The caretaker had gone home, so I was sure the house was empty except for me. I shrugged it off. Old houses make noise. It was a little strange, but I wasn't scared. I packed up my tools and went home. The next morning I walked back into the same hallway and noticed that the wallpaper I'd peeled off was back in place. At first I thought maybe I just made a mistake, but I could see where I'd left scraps in a pile on the floor. Those scraps were gone. The walls looked the same as they had the day before I worked on them. I checked another spot where I'd started patching a section of wood paneling. That patch was gone too, and the paneling was cracked again, just like I'd never touched it. I felt my stomach knot. I didn't have a logical explanation. I knew I'd done the work. My notes said so, and my arms felt sore from all the scraping. I walked through more of the house and saw that everything I'd done had been reversed. I decided it had to be a prank. Maybe some local kids broke in overnight and reattached the wallpaper, though that sounded insane. I couldn't think of any other reason. I went back to the office and checked the old blueprints again. I noticed more details about rooms that shouldn't exist. Some notes suggested these rooms were still there, behind hidden walls, or that they'd been sealed off. Others indicated they were completely demolished. Yet each set of blueprints told a different story. It felt like the house had been rearranged over and over, and none of the plans matched the current reality. That night, I stayed later and set up a small camera in one of the hallways. I also put a motion sensor in the main foyer. I wanted to catch whoever was messing with my work. I spent hours quietly listening. I heard creaking upstairs. I heard what might have been voices, but I couldn't make out any words. I checked every room, shining my flashlight into every corner. I didn't find anyone. Around midnight, I got a strange feeling, like the air was heavier. My skin prickled. I left shortly after because the silence was getting to me. The next morning I hurried to the camera. The memory card showed nothing. The recording ended abruptly around 2 a.m., and it was just static after that. The motion sensor hadn't gone off at all, yet all my previous day's work was undone again. I felt a surge of frustration. I paced around the foyer trying to calm down. I could see that my attempt to fix a section of the railing on the staircase had vanished. The old broken railing was back. Same splinters, same missing chunk of wood. I considered calling the owner and quitting, but something about this job intrigued me. I decided I'd try a different approach. I sealed one room on the ground floor with extra security measures. I brought in a bunch of tools and started a thorough teardown of a rotted section of the wall. I put fresh boards in place and used brand new nails. I hammered them in tight and left a small mark with my initials on a hidden corner so I'd know if it changed. I finished around 8 that night. I locked the door to that room from the inside, then climbed out a window. I locked that window from the outside using a latch I installed. There was no way anyone could get in without breaking something. The next morning I cut the exterior latch, opened the window and climbed back into the room. Everything was undone. The old boards were back, my nails were gone, and my initials were nowhere to be found. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no sawdust. It was like time had reversed itself in that one space. I didn't like how my hands were shaking. I tried to steady myself by focusing on the facts. The caretaker insisted nobody else had a key, and the windows were secure. Yet, the work was reversed. I told him what was happening, but he just stared at the floor. He said some of the previous crews had noticed small things disappearing overnight, but nobody had documented it as clearly as I had. That day, I went back to the office and examined the oldest blueprint. It showed a narrow staircase leading to a third-floor area that wasn't on any of the modern plans. I walked around upstairs for nearly an hour, tapping on walls and checking for hollow spots. Eventually, in a corner of the corridor behind a large closet, I found what felt like a thin seam. I pried off some paneling and discovered an old door. It was locked, but I forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, there was a tiny landing at the top of a steep wooden staircase. It smelled damp, like the air hadn't moved in decades. My flashlight revealed dusty steps and cobwebs. At the top, there was a cramped hallway with 3 closed doors. I tried the nearest door. It opened into a room that looked like a small study, with a worn rug and a heavy wooden desk. Dust covered every surface. There was a stack of books on the desk, but I couldn't read the titles because the covers were faded. The second door opened to what might have been a bedroom, empty except for an old chair. The third door was locked and wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed or pried. I heard a faint noise behind the locked door, like someone shifting their weight. My heart pounded. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the wood. I thought I heard low voices, but I couldn't make out actual words. I pounded on the door, asking if anyone was there. No one answered, but the sound stopped. A chill ran across my scalp. I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I left that area right away, shutting the hidden door behind me. I wrote everything down in my notebook, trying to keep track of every detail. I spent the next few days focusing on other tasks. I fixed a few broken windows and reinforced a section of the floor in the main parlor. Each morning my work would be undone. I started sleeping on a cot in one of the downstairs rooms, hoping I'd hear something. Every night I heard tapping noises in the walls, sometimes voices I couldn't locate. I'd get up and check the hall, but I never found anything. My stomach churned with nerves. My mouth felt dry most of the time, and my mind was on edge. I was determined to keep going, but I felt more exhausted each day. One night I climbed back to that hidden third floor and set up a small camera outside the locked door. I didn't open the door again because I was too uneasy. I left the camera recording for hours. The next morning, I grabbed the camera. It had recorded about an hour before the footage cut to static. When I scrolled through the frames, I saw the door start to open by itself. Then the camera feed went out. I nearly dropped the device in shock. I had no explanation for that. There was no sign of forced interference, no damaged wires. It just stopped recording after the door moved. I felt my heart racing, and I realized I was shaking again. My skin felt cold, and my breath came out in quick spurts. I couldn't concentrate on the restoration anymore. Something in this house was pushing back against every change I tried to make. It felt like the building was alive in some way, or at least controlled by something that wanted it to stay the same. The caretaker asked me if I was going to leave. I told him I didn't know yet. I wanted to talk to the owner, but the caretaker said the owner was overseas. He offered to pass along a message, but I wasn't sure what to say. The next day, I tried one last test. I took a single wooden board and wrote the date and time on it in thick marker. I placed it in the main foyer near the stairs where I planned to fix a broken banister. I left it there with a camera aimed at it. I started filming in the afternoon. I watched that board for 6 hours straight, in real time. Nothing happened. It was still there when I went to bed, but in the morning it was gone, and my camera showed static for half the night. I searched the entire foyer and every adjacent room. The board had vanished. The banister was still broken and looked untouched. That final incident pushed me over the edge. My chest felt tight. I was angry and scared. I wanted answer. I confronted the caretaker, demanding a reasonable explanation. He just kept repeating that the house was known to be impossible to renovate and that nobody ever stayed long enough to figure out why. I realized I was at a dead end. Nothing I tried had any lasting effect. No cameras captured the moment the changes disappeared. The caretaker had no solutions. My phone calls to the owner went straight to voicemail. After a few more sleepless nights, I decided there was nothing more I could do. I packed up my tools, loaded them into my truck, and told the caretaker I was finished. He looked relieved. He didn't try to stop me. Before I left, I walked through the foyer one last time. The floor creaked in the same spot it always did. The dusty chandelier above me swayed slightly, as if disturbed by a draft I couldn't feel. My patched-up windows were cracked again. My replaced boards were missing, and my work was erased from every corner of the house. I turned to the caretaker and said, "Tell your boss I did my best." Then I stepped outside, shut the door, and felt the cool air hit my face. My heart pounded. My palms were sweaty. I gripped the steering wheel hard as I drove away. That was the last time I saw the mansion. Sometimes I think about the hidden rooms, the locked door, and those sounds in the walls at night. I still don't have an explanation. All I know is that the house refused to be changed. I wasn't about to stay there forever to figure out why. I can fix structural damage and replace rotted wood, but I can't force a house to accept something it doesn't want. In that place, for whatever reason, wanted me gone. I gave it what it wanted. After all the strange nights and reversed work, I don't think I could have done anything else. I remember the day I found that strange book. I was in the library basement checking an old storage room we rarely used. The place smelled like stale paper and dust. A single overhead light flickered whenever the air conditioning kicked on. The rest of the building was quiet, because it was already close to closing time. I liked that time of day because I could walk through the aisles without people asking me 1,000 questions about where to find this or that. But that night I felt uneasy. I couldn't tell if it was the flickering light or just my nerves acting up. Then I spotted a shelf in the far corner, half hidden behind a tall nestle cart. I pulled the cart aside and saw a thin volume wedged between two large binders. It had no title on the spine, and the cover was blank. I pulled it out and turned it over in my hands. There was no writing on it at all. It felt cold against my fingertips, like it had been kept in a freezer. That was strange, because the room wasn't that cold. I opened the cover and glanced at the first page. It was blank, so was the second page. Then I flipped through the rest of the pages and they all looked empty. I stood there turning pages back and forth, thinking it had to be some kind of notebook or a misprint. I was about to put it back, but something kept me from letting go. I looked at the first page again and noticed faint marks that hadn't been there a second ago. I leaned in, squinting under the flickering light, and saw a sentence forming. I felt my heart speed up. The words were describing the room I stood in, my exact location, and what I was doing right then. My throat went dry and I felt a weird chill roll down my arms. I glanced around, almost expecting someone to be messing with me, but there was no one else in that cramped basement. I took a step back, then focused on the book again. More words appeared. They described how I was staring at the page in confusion. I slammed the book shut and pressed it against my chest. I felt my heart thumping, breathing harder than normal, and sweat gathering on my forehead. I didn't understand how the words were appearing. There was no electronic screen or hidden device that I could see. The pages were just paper as far as I could tell. I wondered if I was hallucinating, maybe from working too many late nights, but I couldn't just dismiss it. I needed to see more. I opened the cover again, flipping to the first blank page. The text was there in clear black lettering, describing my actions. He opens the book again and sees that the words remain on the page.
My skin broke out in goosebumps.
The book was talking about me in real time. I felt a creeping sense of dread, but also curiosity. I whispered, "What the hell is this?" The basement was silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioner. The next sentence formed right before my eyes. He wonders aloud what he has found, but the room offers no answers. I almost dropped the book. The words were appearing the moment I spoke. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of my hand and told myself to calm down. I reminded myself that nothing was physically harming me. It was just text on a page, but the way it followed my every move made my hands shake. I turned around, looking at the dim hallway behind me. The elevator was at the other end, maybe 50 feet away. I wanted to get out of there and go back to the main desk, but I also felt drawn to keep reading. I turned another page, half expecting it to remain blank. Instead, a new paragraph formed, describing what I had just done. It said I was turning around, thinking about leaving, but reluctant to do so because of my curiosity. I tried to breathe slowly, but I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I took a step forward and noticed the text react to that. He steps toward the elevator, thinking it's safer upstairs. The new sentence read, but right under that, a second sentence appeared. He will decide to stay. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't just describing what I was doing, it was predicting what I would do next. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. I looked down at my feet, then back at the page. Part of me wanted to prove the book wrong. I wanted to toss it on the floor and head straight for the elevator, but I didn't move. I stared at the words, they seemed so certain. Then I realized I was still standing there reading exactly as it said I would. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I forced myself to step away from that shelf and walk toward the elevator. My legs felt stiff, as if I were carrying bricks. I told myself I wasn't going to let some strange book control me, but the moment I got within a few steps of the elevator, I felt another surge of curiosity. My mind told me I needed to see more of what was written, so I turned around and walked back. It was the weirdest feeling, like fighting with my own instincts. When I opened the book again, I saw new lines forming on a fresh page. He tries to resist, but the pull of the words is too strong. It said, my throat felt tight. My skin was clammy. I wiped my hands on my pants and tried to think logically. There was nobody in that basement besides me. No security cameras were pointed at me, and I couldn't see any hidden projectors. The light above kept flickering, and each time it dimmed, I felt this spike of tension like something was about to jump out of the shadows. But nothing did. It was just me, the metal shelves, old boxes, and that strange book. I decided to take the book upstairs, hoping I'd figure out what was going on in better light. I reached out and slid the book into my messenger bag. The text described me doing exactly that. Before I closed it, I caught a glimpse of the next sentence. He will try to escape the basement, but he will find himself returning soon. That made me stop for a second. Return soon? I shook my head and told myself it was nonsense. I walked to the elevator with quick steps. I pressed a button and felt a slight relief when the elevator doors opened right away. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered. I checked behind me. No one was there. My heart was still hammering, but I forced myself to swallow and pressed the button for the first floor. When I got off the elevator, I saw the main area of the library was pretty empty. 1 or 2 people were wandering between shelves in the fiction section, but it was close to closing time. I glanced at the big clock above the front desk. We had about 15 minutes until I had to lock up. The overhead lights felt less threatening up here, and I could hear the faint background music we sometimes played. I made my way to the front desk, set my bag down, and pulled out the book. I flipped it open again, and sure enough, the text was there. It described the elevator ride and me arriving at the first floor. As I read on, it explained that I would talk to my co-worker about it, but I didn't see my co-worker anywhere. He must have been in another part of the library or maybe on break. The next line read, he realizes he is alone at the front desk and decides to read more. My mouth went dry again. I found it weird how the book assumed I'd read more, but there I was, flipping another page, watching new sentences appear. He continues to search for an explanation, ignoring the nagging feeling that he's being watched. I looked around, half expecting to see someone peering at me from behind a row of shelves. Nobody was there. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and a distant squeak from someone moving a cart. I rubbed my temple. A growing headache from all this stress had me wanting to shut the book and wait until morning to deal with it. But I kept turning pages. They filled with text line after line describing my thoughts and actions. Then it mentioned something else. You will hear a noise from the basement and feel compelled to check it out. Right on cue, I heard a faint clanking sound echoing from down the hallway near the elevator. My stomach clenched. I told myself it was probably just the old pipes or the AC unit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the book was right. I tried to resist the urge to investigate, but my curiosity flared again. As I pictured the basement door, my chest tightened. I hated how I felt drawn back there, but I had to see if the noise was real. I put the book back in my bag and walked toward the elevator. The elevator ride down felt like it took forever. Every time the doors rattled, my pulse spiked. When I reached the basement, I stepped out into the hallway. The flickering light was still doing its thing, casting weird shadows on the concrete floor. The clanking noise stopped the moment I walked in. I listened hard, but all I heard was my own breathing. The storage area was straight ahead. I walked slowly, trying not to make any noise. My shoes squeaked a bit on the floor. When I got to the door of the old storage room, I felt a chill in the air. I don't know if it was the AC or just my nerves. I opened the door and stepped inside. It was dark, and I fumbled for the light switch on the wall to my right. The overhead bulb buzzed, flickered, then settled into a weak glow. Everything looked the same as before. Old shelves, dusty boxes, and that same musty smell. But the shelf where I'd found the book looked different. The books and binders on either side had been knocked off and scattered on the floor. I knelt down to touch one of the binders. It was warm, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight, but there was no window down here. I pulled out the strange book from my bag again. My hands trembled slightly, but I needed to see what it said. I opened it to the current page. Then it said I'd pick up something from the floor. As soon as I read that, I realized I was already bending down. I picked up a small wooden box that had fallen behind the shelf. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. It looked old and had some scratches on the surface. There was no lock or latch, just a simple lid. I lifted the lid and saw it was empty except for a folded slip of paper. Then letters appeared, just like they did in the book. The note read, "Now you understand you're part of this story." My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my neck. My stomach felt twisted, and a wave of chills ran through my arms and legs. Part of the story? My voice echoed in the silent room. He wonders who wrote this note and if there's a way to stop the story from continuing. I didn't like any of this. I felt trapped. I wanted to throw the book in the trash or burn it, but I didn't want to risk some weird consequence. That thought alone showed how much I'd started to believe in the power of this thing. My head pounded. I needed air. I needed to go back upstairs and close up the library. So I shoved the wooden box and the note back onto the shelf. When I reached the first floor, I saw my co-worker by the front entrance getting ready to leave. I told him I was just tired. I didn't bring up the book. I didn't want to sound crazy. We locked up the library, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The air felt chilly, and the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement. There must have been a light rain earlier. I said goodnight to my co-worker, then got into my car. I sat in the driver's seat holding the steering wheel, thinking about what I just experienced. My heart was still racing. I felt a strange compulsion to open the book again, but I also wanted to stay as far away from it as possible. In the end, curiosity won out. I pulled the book from my bag and balanced it on my lap. Using the faint light from the street lamp, I opened it. The new lines described me sitting in my car, hesitating to drive away and checking the book one more time. That was all. No big revelations, no warnings. Just a statement of fact matching my reality. I kept reading, waiting for something else to appear. My hands trembled. Then a new sentence formed at the bottom of the page. "He will come back to the library tomorrow night," drawn by the unfinished story. Shiver ran down my spine. My first impulse was to mutter, "No way in hell." But deep down, I knew I'd come back. I wanted to understand how this thing worked. I needed to see if the story would end or if it would keep going. I slammed the book shut, tossed it onto the passenger seat, and started my car. As I drove home, I kept glancing at the book on the seat, expecting it to open on its own. Of course, it stayed closed. The streets were quiet, and I felt every bump in the road. My mind was spinning with questions. Who made this book? Why me? Is it controlling my life, or just predicting it? There's no sign of anyone else pulling the strings. There's no hidden camera in my car. This is between me and that book. That thought alone kept me tense the entire drive home. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door behind me, set the book on my kitchen table, and tried to ignore it while I took a shower. The hot water felt good, but I couldn't relax. My thoughts wouldn't let go. Eventually I toweled off, pulled on some clothes, and sat at my table with the book again. I flipped through the pages, noticing that everything that happened was there, right up until I sat down to read. Then, fresh text began to appear. He sits down at his table, ignoring his tired eyes, and reads on. I slammed the cover shut, put the book in a drawer, and crawled into bed. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured words forming on those pages, but I finally drifted off after what felt like hours. The next day, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed and my eyes burned. I stared at the closed drawer where I'd hidden the book. I thought about ignoring it, leaving it there, and going to work like nothing happened, but a strong urge made me reach for that drawer. My hands were shaking when I pulled it open. The book lay there, looking as plain as ever. I touched the cover. It felt cold, just like before. I knew I'd be going back to the library that night. The book had already said so, and deep down, I believed it. I hated how it was controlling me, or at least predicting my moves, but I needed answers, and that's what drove me to continue. I can't explain it logically, but that's the reality I'm stuck in part of this story, and don't know how or if it ever ends. All I can do is keep reading, and hope the next page reveals a way out. And until then, I'll be doing exactly what the text says it'll do, whether I like it or not. I got to the house on a Friday afternoon, right after a long drive along a narrow road that cut through dense trees and rocky slopes. The real estate agent had told me the place was isolated, but I didn't expect to see so few signs of life once I arrived. The front yard was overgrown and full of tangled weeds. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The door felt stuck until I shoved it open, and a cold draft hit me in the face. I stood in the foyer, dropped my suitcase, and told myself I'd settle in right away. I just wanted a quiet space to focus on my new book. I'm a writer, but not famous. I've had a few works published online and in small presses. My agent suggested that I lock myself away for a while to finish my manuscript without distractions. When I saw an ad for this place, I thought the price was too good to be true. I came out to see it, decided it was perfect for my needs, and signed the paperwork. The house was bigger than I required, but it had an appeal. Old, creaky floors, tall windows, and a dusty attic. It felt private. I liked that. The first day I unpacked my suitcase in the main bedroom. That room was on the second floor near a hallway that led to a wooden staircase going up to the attic. The hinges on that attic door looked rusted. The real estate agent said there wasn't much up there, just some old furniture and a few boxes left by previous owners. I didn't have plans to store anything, so I stayed away from it for the rest of the day. I set up my laptop on a small desk in the living room downstairs. The floorboards squeaked every time I moved. The furniture that came with the house looked outdated. The couch had stains on its fabric and the coffee table had scratches across its surface. But I didn't care. I just needed a roof, a table, and enough room to pace around when I got stuck on a story idea. I spent a few hours that night brainstorming, then went to bed early. My plan was to wake up at sunrise, do some writing, and continue at a steady pace. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange noise. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon scurrying on the roof, or maybe a branch scraping against a window. I tried to roll over and ignore it, but then I heard a steady clacking sound. It reminded me of old typing, like the sound of mechanical keys hitting paper. I had an aunt who used a typewriter when I was a kid, so I recognized the noise. It came in short bursts, then paused, then started again. I couldn't shake it off as my imagination. It was clear and rhythmic. I got out of bed and flipped on the light. My heart thumped in my chest because the house was silent except for that clacking. I checked the hallway, but it was empty. The house felt cold, so I grabbed a sweater. I stood there, listening. The sound seemed to come from above me. I tilted my head. It was definitely upstairs. I realized it must be in the attic. My thoughts raced. Maybe some old wiring was making weird noises. Could it be the wind rattling something? But that typing pattern was too distinct. I took a flashlight from my suitcase and walked toward the attic stairs. My stomach felt tight, and my pulse picked up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but there was probably a rational explanation. I reached the attic door, noticed it was slightly ajar, and felt a draft waft out from inside. I pushed the door open. The old hinges squeaked. A musty smell hit me as I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The steps creaked under my weight. The typing sound got louder. I thought, why would there be a typewriter up here? But the noise was so real that I couldn't ignore it. At the top of the stairs, I aimed the flashlight around. I saw a few crates along the walls. Some rolled-up rugs were in a small table near a window. On top of that table sat a black, dusty typewriter. My breath caught in my throat. The typewriter's keys were moving on their own. I froze. I could see them pressing down in sequence as if an invisible set of fingers were typing out sentences. I saw the carriage shift at the end of the line. I heard the ding from the margin release. Then the keys continued to roll. I stood there, unable to move. My entire body felt prickly with adrenaline. I took a step closer. The typewriter kept going, clack, 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 as if someone was in a hurry to get a story onto the page. There was a yellowing piece of paper rolled into it, and words appeared letter by letter. I focused my flashlight on the page. The text read, "He stands in the attic, watching the keys pound out his truth." I blinked a few times. I thought I was hallucinating. I leaned in and the typing stopped mid-sentence. The last letter struck the paper with a hard snap. Then the attic fell silent. I felt sweat trickling down the back of my neck. My chest felt tight. I looked at the page again. The paragraph above that sentence was something about my childhood home. It mentioned a detail about my old bedroom curtains, which were dark blue with little patterns of baseballs. I never told anyone about that detail. I didn't even remember it until that moment. The words on the page described my second-floor bedroom in that old house. There was no reason for this typewriter to know about it. But the text was there, typed and clear. I ripped the page out of the typewriter and held it up to my flashlight. I read more. It mentioned a note I once hid under a loose floorboard in that bedroom. I had forgotten about that note. I felt lightheaded. There was no explanation for how this machine could record something so personal. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. I left the attic, page in hand, and carefully shut the door. Back in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed. My mind spun with questions. I told myself I would check the attic in the morning. Maybe see if there was a hidden camera or some weird mechanical device in the typewriter. I put the page on my nightstand, turned off the light, and eventually dozed off. That morning, I woke up around 8 with a headache. I thought maybe I had imagined the entire incident in a half-asleep state. But then I saw the typed page right there on my nightstand, and my stomach churned. I decided to investigate. I drank some coffee in the kitchen, then forced myself up the attic stairs again, in daylight. The attic looked less intimidating. It was just dusty and cramped. The typewriter still sat on the table. No cords, no sign of any fancy mechanical rig. I lifted it. It was heavy, old-fashioned. I set it back down. I pressed a few keys manually, and they worked fine. No sign of any tampering. My instincts told me this was impossible, yet I saw it happen. I left the attic feeling unsettled. I tried to focus on writing my own manuscript downstairs. I typed a few pages on my laptop, trying to ignore the weirdness. But my mind kept drifting back to that clacking in the night. I stared at the clock, counting down the hours until evening. When the sun went down, I felt a tightness in my chest again. Around midnight, I settled onto the couch with my laptop. I drank some water and tried to read over my notes. Around 1 in the morning, I heard that clacking sound again. It was faint, but it was there. I turned off the lights, hoping maybe I could figure out if there was someone up there. I crept up the stairs, but when I reached the attic door, the typing stopped. I opened it slowly and found the typewriter silent. No new pages had been typed. I felt a chill in the air. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears. Nothing. I headed back downstairs, but I couldn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, louder this time. I rushed upstairs, flicked on the attic light, and saw the typewriter keys moving. A fresh piece of paper was rolling through. I watched letters appear. He tries to catch me in the act, but he never sees me. My heart pounded. My hands started shaking. I said out loud, "Who's doing this?" No answer, just the click and clack of the keys. I forced myself to step closer. My throat felt dry. I looked at the page. It now described events that hadn't happened yet. It mentioned me waking up in the middle of the night tomorrow, hearing the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. The text even described how I'd feel panic surge through me. Then at the bottom it said, "He senses someone watching him from the window." I took that sheet of paper and left the attic. I shut the door behind me. I grabbed a chair from the hallway and jammed it against the doorknob to keep the door from opening. I wasn't sure if that would help, but I felt desperate to do something. My heart was still racing. My breathing was uneven. I went to my bedroom and locked the door. I sat on the bed, scanning the words on that page over and over. The details about future events bothered me. Why would this typewriter predict something that's specific? The next day, I tried to ignore it. I wrote a few chapters for my book, prepared a simple lunch, and avoided looking at the attic door. I felt uneasy in every corner of the house. It was too quiet. The slightest creak of the wood floors made me jump. I kept thinking about the text that described me hearing footsteps at night. That evening, I decided to stay up, sitting in bed with a small lamp on. I opened a book to keep my mind off things. I told myself that if I heard something, I'd investigate calmly. For a few hours, everything stayed silent. Then, close to midnight, I heard a faint thump in the hallway. I froze. The hair on my arm stood up. It sounded like someone stepping carefully on a loose floorboard. Then, it stopped. I turned off the lamp. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my ears. I inched over to the door and pressed my ear to it. Another quiet thump made my stomach twist. I thought of the typewriter's words about me hearing footsteps. I felt my hands shaking. I reached for the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. I stood there, barely breathing. After a few moments, I heard the floor creak again, then silence. Eventually, I forced myself to open the door. The hallway light was on. It looked empty. I saw no footprints, no sign of anyone. I checked the attic door. My chair was still wedged against it. Everything appeared normal, yet I had heard those noises. Over the next few days, I felt trapped in a cycle of stress. I'd hear the typewriter late at night, but by the time I got to the attic, it would stop. Sometimes I caught it mid-typing. It always produced pages that described moments from my past or future. I read about an old argument I once had with a close friend. I read about an upcoming scene in my life where I'd see a figure standing outside my window. Each new page hinted at me being watched. The words kept repeating phrases like "he feels eyes on him" or "he senses a presence behind him." It was enough to keep me from sleeping well. Every noise made me think there was someone in the house. A week passed, and my nerves were on edge. I had half a mind to leave, but my book wasn't finished. Plus, I felt a strange pull to understand what was happening. I took the typed pages and put them in a folder, thinking I might try to see if any events actually came true. Some parts about the future were vague, but the mention of seeing a figure outside was very direct. It said I'd be in the living room, and I'd notice a silhouette by the window. But as I lifted the crate, I found another fresh page sticking out. The typewriter had somehow typed underneath the crate. I snatched the page and read it in the dim morning light. The final line said, "He can't block me. I see him everywhere. I wait in the corners." My heart pounded. I hurried downstairs, grabbed my laptop, and typed out some frantic notes about everything that happened. I wanted a record beyond those creepy pages. I spent the next few hours pacing around the living room. My eyes kept darting to the windows. I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the yard, but when I looked closer, there was nothing. At this point, I haven't solved the mystery of that typewriter. The pages keep showing up whenever I return to the attic. They describe things that happened to me years ago. Details nobody else would know. They also describe moments that will happen in the house before they occur. I don't know how it works. I haven't seen anyone come in or out. My door stays locked, and my windows are shut. But the pages keep appearing, and the typewriter keeps typing. I keep seeing vague shapes outside, like someone pacing around the perimeter of the house. I haven't left yet. I think about it every day, but I'm determined to finish my manuscript. Part of me feels like if I just tough it out, I'll get through this. I don't know if I'm right. Each night I hear new sounds. Sometimes it's footsteps, sometimes it's sad clacking sound. Last night I woke up in a sweat, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, but I didn't see anything when I flicked on the light. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. As I'm telling you this, I keep glancing over my shoulder. The house is silent right now, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Whenever I walk into a room, I have the urge to look at the corners. I keep the curtains closed most of the time. I'm still writing my book, but I can't concentrate for long stretches. My head aches from lack of sleep, and I jump at every bump or creak. I've started stacking furniture in front of the attic door at night. It doesn't help. Every morning there's a new page sitting on the hallway floor, typed out in that same mechanical font. The sentences on those pages say things like, "He tries to keep me out, but I'm in already." And each time I read them, my stomach drops. I don't know if there's an actual person behind this or if there's something else going on. Right now, I feel tension in my neck and shoulders all day long. I lock every door and I check every window, but I can't stop the typewriter. I can't stop the words that show up on the pages, and I can't ignore the sense that somewhere in the darkness there's someone or something that keeps track of every breath I take. I have no explanation for it. I just know it's happening. They'll keep writing, as long as I can stand it. But every time I try to sleep, I remember those lines about a figure standing by the window or footsteps outside my bedroom. My hands tremble when I recall the specific details the typewriter typed about my past. The rational part of my mind tries to convince me that it's all some elaborate trick or a glitch in my brain. But the pages are real, and the events it predicts keep lining up with my reality. I don't have a nice ending to the story. I'm still here, in this house, with that typewriter in the attic. I've considered throwing it out, but some part of me worries about what might happen if I do. Would that fix things, or would it make them worse? For now I only know one thing. Every night, I hear the clack of those keys, and every morning I find a new page that describes my life more accurately than anything I could write on my own. And each time I think about leaving, I see a shape moving just beyond the curtains, reminding me that it's not that simple. I'm still waiting for answers, and I'm not sure they'll ever come. I opened the door one morning and saw a small brown package on my doorstep. It had no return address. My name was written across the top in messy black marker. I picked it up, felt how light it was, and heard no rattling inside or any obvious sign of what could be there. I brought it into my apartment, set it on the kitchen table, and looked at it for a while. I felt a little tug of curiosity, like a knot in my stomach that wouldn't let go. I was used to receiving weird things in the mail because I work as a freelance translator, but this one felt different. I sliced open the box with a steak knife. Inside there was a single slim manuscript wrapped in plain brown paper that looked old. The cover page had a few words in a script I recognized as Aramaic, an ancient language I'd worked on only a handful of times. My pulse quickened. It's not every day I get something in Aramaic, especially something this worn. A single note slipped out from between the pages. It said, "Translate everything, deliver it in 2 weeks, payment will follow." No name, no signature. It felt strange, but it wasn't the first time I'd gotten hush-hush jobs. Usually I shrugged them off, but I needed the money, and ancient languages were my specialty. I sat down at my desk, turned on my reading lamp, and checked the first few lines. The Aramaic script was uneven, like it had been written by hand. I noticed small ink smudges in the margins. Each page felt fragile. My eyes adjusted to the tiny symbols, and I tried to read the opening phrase. It was something about a journey across a desert. The script was archaic, so I had to reference some older notes I kept in a binder. As soon as I recognized a phrase, I wrote a translation in my notepad. I wanted to start systematically, piece by piece. That night, I went to bed around midnight. I was tired but excited. Ancient manuscripts like this often contained clues to old traditions or lost stories. My mind was buzzing with possibilities. I remembered drifting off, imagining the next lines of text. When I woke up the next morning, I felt a strange stiffness in my forearms. My sheets were bunched up around my legs, and my heart was pounding a little. I went to the bathroom and flipped on the light. My reflection looked normal at first, but then I noticed faint marks on my left forearm. I leaned in and saw lines of text in dark, thin characters that looked just like Aramaic. I tried rubbing them, but they didn't go away. They weren't smudges of pen ink. They were under my skin like tattoos. I touched them, and they felt smooth and painless. My pulse raced. I splashed cold water on my face. My stomach felt tight. I stepped back and stared. There were about 5 words. Each word matched something I had translated the night before. I recognized the pattern of letters, the same ones I typed into my notepad. My throat went dry. I turned off the faucet and walked to the living room, feeling the tension in my shoulders like I was bracing for something else to happen. I opened the manuscript again, scanning the lines, trying to make sense of what was going on. I couldn't figure it out, so I just sat there. My arms felt warm but not painful. Eventually, I had to go about my day. I had no explanation, so I just tried to ignore it. Later that evening, the tattoos began to fade. By midnight, they were gone entirely, like they'd never been there. I felt relief, but I couldn't deny that they had looked real. I checked my bed. I didn't see any ink stains or anything that would explain it. I decided not to tell anyone yet. I figured I might be stressed, maybe hallucinating, although that seemed ridiculous. But I kept going with the job, because I needed to get paid. The next day, I focused on the second part of the manuscript. It described a caravan traveling across a rocky landscape. There were mentions of trade goods and the price of certain spices. It was pretty dry stuff, but I wrote out the translations carefully. I ended up working until late again. I went to bed around 1 a.m. and tossed and turned, unable to stop thinking about the bizarre appearance of those words on my arm. Finally, I fell asleep. I remember dreaming I was riding on a camel through a rocky pass, feeling the heat on my skin, smelling something pungent like burning resin. I even felt the jostle of the animal under me. It was intense. When I woke up, I was sweaty and my heart was racing. I also felt something tight around my bicep. I pulled up my sleeve and saw fresh Aramaic text again, this time spiraling around my upper arm. I jumped out of bed and went straight to the bathroom mirror. The text was darker than before, more pronounced. I leaned in and saw tiny details in each letter. I recognized phrases about the cost of spices, the weight of certain cargo, things I'd translated the previous night. It matched perfectly. My hands shook a little. My stomach churned. I felt a light throbbing in my arm. Not pain, more like a faint pressure. I tried to stay calm. I paced around the apartment, checking my phone for some logical explanation, but I found nothing. Then I decided to wait and see if it would fade again by evening. Sure enough, by midnight the words were mostly gone. leaving only a faint outline that disappeared as I showered. I breathed a little easier, thinking maybe it was temporary, but I still had no idea why it was happening. The next day I sat in front of the manuscript again, determined to finish my work on time. My head pounded, probably from lack of sleep. I made coffee and tried to concentrate. The text was getting more complicated. It began describing some kind of ritual, though the details were unclear. I strained my eyes, looking up ancient dictionaries to confirm certain terms. I saw references to an offering on a stone table and references to binding words in flesh, but the text cut off abruptly before fully explaining. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I worked straight through lunch, ignoring my growling stomach. By the time I stopped, the sun was going down. I had translated another good chunk. I saved the files on my laptop and tried to decompress. I half expected something to appear on my skin right away, but I knew it only happened after I slept. That night, I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. Then I dreamed again, but this time I saw a dimly lit chamber. I walked barefoot on cold stone floors. I heard distant chanting that made my chest tighten. I saw shadows flicker on the walls. My heart thudded in my chest. I tried to speak, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. When I woke up, my entire torso felt tight, like I had done an intense workout. I sat up and turned on the lamp. My shirt felt damp with sweat. I pulled it off and saw words covering my chest and sides. They weren't random lines, they formed neat rows, each letter about an inch high. I touched them, feeling the raised skin. They looked like scars, but they didn't hurt. I felt waves of adrenaline flood my body. My breathing got shallow. I ran my hand across my ribs. It all felt so real. I knew these were the words from the part of the manuscript about that ritual. I got up, peeled off the rest of my damp clothes, and took a shower. The words didn't fade under the hot water. I scrubbed them with a sponge, but they didn't wash off. That scared me. They usually faded by evening. I stood there, the water pelting my back, and my thoughts were racing in circles. I decided I needed to keep translating to see if I could find some explanation. The note said I had 2 weeks, and I wasn't halfway done yet. That day, I forced myself to keep working. My chest felt itchy, but I ignored it. I read the next part of the manuscript. It talked about a dreamlike connection between the scribe and something called the Word and flesh. The text described a state where writing took shape on a person's body. I translated line after line, feeling my pulse hammer in my temples. My arms shook when I typed. I felt sure this was describing exactly what was happening to me. I tried to remain calm and keep going. That night, I dreamed I was sitting in that chamber again, hunched over a low table, writing on some type of scroll. The air smelled damp. I felt sweat run down my face. My back ached. In the dream, I glanced at my own arms and saw the same text I had been translating. I woke up gasping, tangled in my sheets, cold sweat everywhere. My mouth was dry. My heart felt like it was about to break through my ribs. I looked at my chest again and the words were still there, the same as the day before. I felt a lump in my throat. I checked my arms and I saw new lines running down to my wrists. I swore under my breath. My entire body tensed up. I walked to the kitchen and drank 2 glasses of water. My stomach was in knots, but I forced the water down. For the rest of the week, the tattoos kept building. They spread across my shoulders, down my back, even around my ankles. Every morning I woke up with more text. My routine became checking how many new lines had appeared, then showering and trying to ignore the fear crawling through my body. I started keeping a log in my phone, photographing the text in case it faded. Some of it still disappeared at night, but bits of it lingered. After 3 days, a few lines on my left arm never disappeared at all. They stayed there, black and sharp. I noticed that whenever I read those words in the manuscript, it felt like I'd already known them my whole life. They triggered a weird familiarity inside me. My dreams grew more vivid. Every time I fell asleep, I found myself living scenes from the manuscript. I saw caravans in deserts, men talking in low voices, people organizing rituals in hidden caves. I heard my own voice speaking as if it were my first language. When I woke up, the details haunted me. Sometimes I tried to recite the words I'd heard, and they came out half-formed from my mouth, like I was on the edge of remembering. My body felt exhausted all the time. I never truly rested. One afternoon, I noticed a friend had called, but I hadn't bothered to call back. I felt too anxious to explain what was going on. The idea of showing him my body covered in ancient text terrified me. I also worried he might think I was going crazy. So, I isolated myself. I stopped going out for groceries and just ordered delivery. My trash piled up near the door. My apartment started smelling stale. I barely noticed. I was consumed by the translations and the changes in my skin. A few nights before my 2-week deadline, the text described a final sequence of events. It talked about completing a process called the sealing. The line said something about binding all the words to the body so that the author's memory could live on. My chest tightened when I read that. I felt sweat under my arms. The page's last lines mentioned that once the sealing began, the scribe wouldn't be able to remove the words. My eyes started throbbing. I realized I might not have a choice in the matter. The text described how the scribe's dreams would merge with the original writer's memories. I looked down at my arms, my chest, my thighs. Everywhere I saw black Aramaic letters. Many of them were now permanent, refusing to fade even a little. I felt panic swirl in my stomach. I finished the translation 2 days before the deadline. I compiled it into a clean document, double-checked my notes, and saved it. I emailed it to the address I'd been given in a separate message. Then I waited. I didn't know if the job was done or if something else would happen. I felt drained, like I had nothing left to give. That night I forced myself to go to bed early, even though I dreaded the dream that would come. As soon as I drifted off, I saw that chamber again. I was standing near an ancient stone table. The walls were lit by flickering torches. I heard my own voice chanting in Aramaic. My chest felt heavy, like a weight pressed against it. I saw my arms in the dream, covered in text. I touched my own skin and felt it burn. Then I woke up gasping. My arms hurt in real life too. The tattoos felt hot, like they were on fire. I ran to the sink and splashed water on them, but it did nothing. My body trembled as I realized that the words were binding themselves to me permanently, just like the text described. I stood there in my living room with water dripping onto the floor, my mind spinning. But after a few minutes, the burning calmed, leaving my arms still feeling sensitive, but the pain subsided. In the mirror, the lines looked darker than ever. I spent the next day holed up at my desk, flipping through the manuscript again, though I'd already translated it. I kept searching for some final note or hidden instruction about reversing the process, but I didn't find anything. Eventually I pushed the pages away and just sat there, staring at the wall. My body felt strange, like it wasn't fully mine. I had lines on my skin that belonged to some ancient writer. I had memories in my head that weren't my own, but I was still breathing, still in my apartment. No one was forcing me to do anything anymore. Maybe the job was over. The next morning, I got an email confirming receipt of the translation. There was no mention of the tattoos or any unusual circumstances. I just stared at the screen, feeling a numb mixture of relief and confusion. I looked down at my arms, covered in those black lines. Some of them might never fade. My heartbeat slowed a bit. Maybe I could live with it. I had no clue if the dreams would keep coming. I touched them. They felt warm. I didn't know what else I could do but accept them. So I kept going, step by step. I took a fresh shower, got dressed, and moved on with my day. Even though part of me felt like I was still living in 2 times at once, I had no choice. I tried to stay present. At least for now, that's all I could do. I never expected a camera to change the way I look at my own workspace. I thought I was just collecting another piece of history, something old and interesting for my shelves. But I was wrong. This thing felt different from day one. When I first saw that 19th century daguerreotype camera at a small private auction, I noticed a strange tension in the air. The auctioneer didn't say much about it, and the other attendees acted like they didn't see it at all. I felt an odd pull. I knew I had to have it. I'm a photography historian. I've handled plenty of old cameras, so I usually know what I'm getting into. This one had the typical signs of its age: tarnished metal fittings, a wooden box with shallow scratches and a cloudy lens that needed cleaning. It was labeled as a mid-19th century daguerreotype camera, but the label looked new, like someone had replaced it. I remember thinking it might be a rare prototype or model from a lesser-known maker, so I placed my bid. I ended up winning without much of a fight. A few people raised their eyebrows, but nobody tried to outbid me once the price passed a certain point. It felt like they wanted me to take it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I brought it home and placed it on my workbench. My studio is basically my second home. It's a large space in a converted warehouse with high ceilings and concrete floors. I have shelves full of photography equipment plus a table for restoration projects. I remember feeling excited to dig into the camera's workings. I took it apart carefully. The internal mechanisms were intact, though old. The lens was a simple meniscus lens, typical for a camera of that era. But there was a subtle inscription inside the brass rim, a circle inside a triangle, with lines crossing in a pattern I'd never seen in any reference book. I felt a small chill when I touched it, like static electricity, but I shrugged it off. Sometimes old metal can do that. I worked on cleaning the lens, polishing some parts, and checking the bellows for leaks. Then I decided to see if it could still take a decent image. I prepared a plate in the old style, which is a process I'm used to doing for demonstrations. I went through the usual steps with the chemicals and exposure. I set up a test shot in my studio, pointing the camera at a blank wall. My plan was to see if the camera could capture anything at all. After the exposure, I developed the plate in my makeshift darkroom area. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at my studio wall. The image showed a Victorian-style room with a high ceiling, a large oak table in the center, and a man standing near the table. He wore an elegant suit with a vest, cravat, and slicked back hair. He seemed to be looking down at something, maybe adjusting a set of glass tubes and metal coils on the table. I just stared at the plate, feeling the hair on my arm stand up. I didn't understand how that could happen. I thought maybe I messed up the exposure or used a plate with a ghost image, but the image was too clear. I could see every detail in that Victorian room. There was a faint reflection in the large mirror behind the man. It showed the side of his face, some furniture in the corner, and a curious silver stand that could have been a candle holder. I turned the plate in my hands. It felt solid. The entire image was sharp. There was no sign of double exposure. I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. I tried again with a fresh plate. This time I aimed the camera at a different corner of my studio, near some boxes stacked by the door. After the development process, I stood there, looking at another image of the same Victorian room. Now the man had his hands on a contraption that looked more assembled than before. Some wires connected a small metal sphere to what looked like a glass container. The setup reminded me of a basic science experiment. He wasn't looking at the camera. He seemed too busy. I noticed a tall clock in the background which showed about 3:15, but I couldn't tell if it was morning or afternoon. I kept working on new plates, each time getting a new photo of that same room. The experiment on the table looked more complete with every shot. The man's posture changed slightly each time. One time he was leaning forward, and the next time he had turned a knob on the machine. My hands were shaking when I removed the plate from the developer. My breath felt tight in my chest, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I started pacing around my studio, checking the camera for hidden mechanisms or a trick. I found nothing suspicious inside, just old components, brass screws and a lens. No modern electronics, no memory cards, no hidden compartments. A knot formed in my stomach. I wanted to stop, but I also felt compelled to keep going. I needed answers. On the fourth photo, something changed in my own space. I set up the camera, took a shot of an empty corner, and developed the plate. The resulting image showed the Victorian room again, but there was a new object on the floor, a small rectangular box with a hinged lid. In my actual studio, at that exact spot, I saw that same box. It was right there, sitting on my floor. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it, unsure if I should pick it up. My breathing felt uneven. I felt sweat on the back of my neck. I walked over and nudged the box with my foot. It was real, made of wood with metal corners. I opened it. It was empty except for a faint smell of something chemical, like old varnish or a mild acid. I shut it and looked back at the camera. I remember wanting to smash the camera then, but I didn't. Instead, I checked to the next plate. On the fifth photo, the man in the Victorian room was looking over his shoulder as if he heard something. The contraption on the table glowed faintly in the image, or at least it appeared brighter than before. There was a spark or small flash. Then I noticed something else. In the far corner I saw a shadowy figure shaped like a person but too dark to see any details. That corner of the image felt cold when I touched it. I know that sounds strange, but it felt different from the rest of the plate. I set the plate on the table. Then I realized that the corner of my studio behind me also felt colder. I felt a chill on my neck. I spun around, but I was alone. At that point, point, I decided to leave the studio for a bit. I drove to a nearby coffee shop and tried to calm down. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but the reality was that objects from these images were appearing in my workspace and the images themselves were showing more of that experiment. I sipped my coffee and tried to think of a rational explanation, but I couldn't. After about an hour, I returned to the studio, and everything was the same as I had left it, including the box on the floor. I told myself I would do one more photo just to see if anything changed again. I set the camera up to face a blank section of wall. I used another prepared plate and went through the same development process. My hands were shaking. When I finally saw the image, I let out a sharp breath. The Victorian man was now flipping a switch on his contraption. Sparks seemed to dance across the glass tubes. The metal sphere had a faint halo around it. He was turning his head toward the corner. I could see the shadowy figure more clearly now. It looked like someone wearing modern clothes just standing there and watching. I leaned closer and recognized the outline of my own jacket. I saw the shape of my shoulders and my hair. I felt my body tighten with fear. That figure in the corner was me. I almost dropped the plate. I steadied myself on the edge of the table. I couldn't ignore what was happening. The more I used this camera, the more it pulled me into that scene. My legs felt weak. I sank onto a stool, rubbing my face. I wanted to throw the camera in the trash, but I also wanted to understand what was going on. I decided to see if that corner of my studio had any new items. I walked to the spot where the figure appeared in the photo and found a short wooden stool with a slightly worn top. It matched the stool in the photo. I reached out and touched it. It was real. There was dust on it, and it squeaked when I put weight on it. My stomach churned. I felt sweat beating on my forehead. I backed away and returned to my main work area. I spent the rest of the evening trying to stay busy, looking through my reference books for anything that could explain these events. I found nothing. The alchemical symbol in the lens was the only clue, but I had no reference for it. I decided to try one last experiment. I wanted to see if the scene would change if I deliberately placed something in front of the camera. I found a heavy metal clamp from my toolbox and placed it about a foot from the camera, in plain view. I took another photo. When I developed the plate, I saw the usual Victorian room. But now, that clamp was on the table next to the contraption. The man's head was turned to look at it. He looked surprised, almost as if he didn't expect to see that object there. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized that I was actively interfering with whatever was happening in that room. I noticed another detail in the background. The clock now read 3. The contraption glowed brighter. The shadow figure in the corner was more distinct. It was definitely me. I saw my face in partial profile. My expression looked intense, as if I were both scared and fascinated. I pressed my lips together and set the plate aside. When I glanced at the table in my studio, the clamp was no longer where I had placed it. It was gone. I found it on the floor near the box. It looked a bit scorched, as if it had been exposed to heat. I picked it up and felt a slight warmth on the metal. My hand jerked back. My pulse pounded as I realized these changes were not random illusions. They felt real, and they left signs of their presence in my studio. I decided to call it a night. I locked up, turned off the lights, and headed home. I barely slept. The next morning, I came back determined not to take any more photos. I planned to wrap the camera in plastic and store it in a locked cabinet. But when I entered the studio, I found the camera set up on the tripod. It was aimed at the center of the room. I'm certain I didn't leave it that way. My heart started racing. I approached it slowly, picking it up to see if anything had changed. The lens seemed a bit clearer than before, almost polished. I had left it in rough condition after the last test, but it looked fresh. I felt fear in my chest, like a tight grip. I tried to calm down by breathing slowly. Part of me wanted to run, but another part of me felt drawn to see what was next. I ended up taking another photo. This time, I stood in front of the camera on purpose, wanting to confront the situation. I went through the exposure, then developed the plate. The image made my stomach twist. I saw the Victorian man standing at his contraption. He was reaching out, and sparks were flying across his hands. The glass tubes and metal coils looked energized. The clock read 3, and in the corner, I saw myself again, fully visible. I was watching him, and our eyes seemed to meet, even though it was just a still image. It was as if we were both aware of each other. I noticed a ring of light circling the man's hand. The wooden stool was behind me. The clamp and the box were on the table. Everything from the previous images was there. A faint outline of a new door was forming on the wall. It looked like a panel door with an ornate handle. I set the plate down and looked around my studio. On the far wall there was a new outline, like someone had drawn the shape of a door with chalk. It was faint, but I could see it. I touched the wall and felt a slight vibration. I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding.
I didn't want to open that door if it ever became real.
I couldn't explain any of this, and I felt trapped between curiosity and panic. I finally decided I had to stop. I took the camera off the tripod, wrapped it in thick canvas, and placed it inside a locked storage cabinet I use for old chemicals. I locked the cabinet with a key. Then I carried the plates and all the related items to a corner of the studio. I covered them with a cloth. I didn't want to see them.
I didn't want to think about them.
I heard my own breathing echo in the silence. I grabbed my coat and left the studio, locking the main door behind me. For the next few days, I avoided going back. I made excuses, stayed home, watched TV, and tried to bury my thoughts in ordinary life. But I felt a constant tension in my chest. I was afraid the camera was still there, changing things. On the third day, I went back. The cabinet was still locked. The camera was still inside. Nothing else seemed changed. The walls looked normal. I decided I would hire someone to move the camera into storage far away. I didn't care what it cost. I just wanted it gone. Right now, I'm writing this from my office at home. I'm planning to have that camera removed in the next few days. But every time I close my eyes, I see that Victorian man with his contraption. I see the shadowy figure in the corner. It's me. I keep thinking about whether the experiment is finished or if it's still going. Sometimes I imagine hearing a faint hum from inside the locked cabinet. I don't know if that's just my imagination. I just know I don't want to take any more photos. Or let someone else figure out what to do with that camera. I'm done.